Spider-Man Brand New Day might have just changed the entire Spider-Man conversation. Or maybe it didn't. I actually don't know yet. I'm filming this a month before the movie comes out. I just kind of said that to sound dramatic. But I do have very high hopes for this movie. But if it sucks, I guess just pretend I didn't say that. But by the time you're watching this, the movie will be out, which means it's finally time to answer the age-long question that Spider-Man fans have been arguing about for decades now. Who is the best Spider-Man? Now, the more I've wrestled with this question throughout the years, the more I've realized it's kind of a vague question because it really depends on what you mean by best. Are you talking about who has the best movies, who has the best performance, or are you just talking about who your own personal favorite is? Some people say Tobey because that's who they grew up with. Some people say Andrew because they just can't stand not having an unpopular opinion. Some people say Tom because he's the perfect mixture of cute and handsome, and he's just a really overall charming guy, and he seems like a really cool dude to just like grab lunch with and chop it up. Huh? At least that's what I've heard other people say. I don't necessarily think that. The point is, I feel like a lot of times with this whole debate, everyone is using a different definition of the word best, which kind of muddies the waters a little bit. So instead of arguing based off nostalgia or vibes, I'm going to try to get as close as possible to a definitive, objective answer. I'm going to do that by watching every live-action Spider-Man movie, including Brand New Day, grading each one across multiple different categories like
filmmaking, writing, cinematography, acting, suit design, quips, humor.
Give each category a score out of 10, total everything up, and then average each actor's trilogy, duology, and I guess quadrilogy together. And then at the end, every Spider-Man is going to have their own definitive score. And hopefully we'll have an answer to the question, who is the best Spider-Man? I'm going to grade every live-action Spider-Man movie using the exact same rubric. I'll probably put it somewhere behind me. But yeah, I color-coded it and everything. I made a whole spreadsheet for this video. This has got to qualify me for some sort of diagnosis. Autism, maybe? Narcissism? I'm literally Spider-Man, and I'm making a whole video about myself, so kind of narcissistic. So those are the 10 categories I'll be grading each movie on. Each one is going to get a score out of 10, and then I'll total everything up. But I did add 2 bonus categories. They're not going to count towards the final score. And those are comic accuracy and the Peter Parker suffering meter. Because everyone knows if Peter Parker isn't going through a death in the family, getting broken up with and cheated on, 9/11, D-Day, Pearl Harbor, all in one weekend, is it really a Spider-Man movie? And the reason I'm not going to count comic accuracy towards the final score of all these movies is because, number 1, I am definitely not the most qualified person to talk about this sort of thing. And number 2, I don't personally think that comic accuracy always equals good. But I could yap about the whole comic accuracy thing for hours. I'm going to get into this way more when I go through all the movies. And yes, I know turning movies to math is kind of lame, kind of strips the fun out of everything. But ironically, I'm just doing all of this for fun. This is all really just an excuse for me to nerd out and talk about Spider-Man for way longer than I should. So don't take the scores of anything too seriously. It's all still subjective at the end of the day. So let's kick the video off with everybody's GOAT, Tobey Maguire from the Sam Raimi Trilogy, baby. This is a lot of information that I'm going through, so I wrote down a bunch of notes on my phone. So if I'm looking down during any of this, that is why. Starting off with the writing of Spider-Man 1, I think this is about as perfect of an origin story as you can get, to be honest. Not only is this one of the best paced superhero movies ever made, I think it's just one of the best paced movies ever. Most of my very few issues with this movie belong in other categories, like Spider-Man not quipping that much, but I'm gonna get to that later. Purely from a writing standpoint, I'm giving Spider-Man 1 a 10 out of 10. Spider-Man 2 goes in a completely different direction. It's way more of a Peter Parker story than it is a Spider-Man story. The entire movie revolves around Peter trying to balance what he wants for his own personal life with the responsibility of being Spider-Man. One thing that I really love about this movie is how much of the storytelling is done without dialogue. The movie trusts the audience to understand how Peter is feeling instead of having the characters just explain everything.
Some poor soul got trapped on the 4th floor. Never made it out. All right, Billy, let's knock it down and roll.
Which may sound like the bare minimum of what you would expect from a movie, but with stuff that comes out nowadays in the era of streaming, stuff like that is very refreshing. And then Aunt May's speech is honestly one of my favorite scenes in any movie ever. Her speech is so powerful, it literally gives Peter his powers back. And it's 100% believable because that shit gets me fired up. I get chills every time I watch that scene. And then later on, Peter takes that same lesson that he learned from Aunt May and he gives it to Doc Ock. If I had to complain about anything in terms of writing, I I would say the ending with MJ and her getting with Peter, because the entire movie kind of revolves around the idea that being Spider-Man means sacrifice. It does work a little bit because MJ knows he's Spider-Man now, so she's fully aware of the risk. And it is kind of satisfying to see Peter finally get a win after being shit on the whole movie. But I almost feel like that conclusion would have paid off better for the third movie. So same thing, I would give Spider-Man 2 a 10 for writing. And then we got Spider-Man 3. It's multiple different storylines fighting over each other. Harry's storyline is easily the weakest written part in the whole movie. The whole amnesia subplot is one of the laziest possible writing decisions imaginable.
Harry bumps his head and suddenly just forgets everything.
Hey, buddy.
Hey.
Hit my head.
How you doing?
Hit my head. Last thing I remember, I was fine. Somewhere.
Never felt better. It's a weird feeling not knowing who you are.
And then his dad starts talking to him beyond the grave through his mirror.
Remember me. I remember.
And then Burner the butler randomly decides, I think now is the perfect time to let Harry know that Spider-Man actually didn't kill his father.
The entire storyline only moves forward because characters conveniently remember and forget things whenever the script needs them to. Venom's whole subplot is just so dumb. He feels like a cartoon character. There's absolutely no depth or character development with him.
I like being bad. It makes me happy.
And making Sandman the actual killer of Uncle Ben is also a questionable decision. It definitely adds some depth to Flint Marco's character and the whole theme of the movie surrounding forgiveness, but it also kind of takes away from the foundational stuff that was laid out in the first movie. I don't think everything here is bad. Sandman is actually the strongest part of this movie. His whole motivation with his daughter, it just would have been so much better if he was the primary focus. There's even a deleted scene that would have been so beautiful if they left it in, and it would have added so much to his character. But you know how Spider-Man movies are, they're always deleting their best scenes. There's a lot of individual scenes and moments that are really great in Spider-Man 3. The problem is they're all trapped inside of a story that's pulling itself in like a million different directions. The next category is Peter Parker's performance / portrayal. I think this is definitely one of the more divisive parts of the Raimi trilogy. In Spider-Man 1, I think Tobey does a great job at selling the shy, socially awkward, isolated nerd, but sometimes he almost feels a little bit too awkward. MJ will ask him questions and he'll just kind of stare at her and go completely non-verbal.
Hey, you have blue eyes. I didn't notice without your glasses. You just get contacts?
There's just some incredibly awkward lines like tally ho, I hunch.
You're taller than you look.
I hunch.
Don't.
But honestly, I kind of love it. And maybe it's because I can personally relate to being painfully awkward basically all the time. Whenever I joke about literally being Spider-Man, this is usually what I'm talking about. But I can also understand if some people might dislike how over-the-top awkward he is. My only real issue with this version of Peter is how much he doesn't look like a high schooler. In the words of Hat Guy from the Escape Pod podcast,
he's got this chubby man boy face.
Spider-Man 1's Peter Parker gets an 8 out of 10. Spider-Man 2's Peter is kind of just the same guy, but he's out of high school now, so Tobey's chubby man boy face kind of fits the role a little bit better. It's a lot more mature, and it's definitely Tobey's best performance as Peter. So Spider-Man 2's Peter gets a 9. Spider-Man 3, this is definitely my least favorite version of Peter Parker. Right from the jump, he's arrogant, super dismissive of MJ, and just really self-centered. Once the black suit takes over, it makes sense, but the problem is he starts acting like that even before he gets the symbiote. And I understand Peter is not supposed to be perfect, but like, this feels like such a completely different dude than the guy we saw in the first two movies. So for Spider-Man 3, Peter Parker gets a 2.5. Next category is villains. Spider-Man 1, I think William Dafoe is a huge part to why this movie is so good. His Goblin is so terrifying and unhinged, but it also fits the campy tone. All the split personality stuff with him would have been so ridiculous if it was any other actor. My only real complaint is the Goblin suit looks like a Power Rangers villain. And also William Dafoe's face is just so insanely expressive, so covering it up with a motorcycle helmet doesn't really make the most sense. And that's why I think it was such a smart move in No Way Home for them to ditch the mask. Regardless, I think Dafoe's Goblin is one of the best villains ever put to screen in the history of ever. So he gets a 9.5. I don't think Doc Ock is on the same level, but he's also just a lot more relatable and a lot more human. And then the hospital scene is just straight up one of the best scenes in any superhero movie ever. Nobody has the balls now to drop a full-on horror scene into a comic book movie. Doc Ock's arms just add a nice layer to all the action and make all the fighting scenes just feel really unique. And I love how the ending ties back to the original theme. Peter and Dr. Octopus literally go through the exact same arc together, just in different ways. So Dr. Octopus also gets a 9.5. For Spider-Man 3, this is kind of like this movie's entire downfall. Sandman, again, is easily the strongest here. His transformation scene is really cool. I think Harry really did have some potential. He does a pretty good performance as the villain. I just wish the writing wasn't so freaking bad. And I'm honestly kind of a defender of his goblin suit. I thought it was awesome when I was a kid, and I still kind of do. Maybe that's nostalgia. And then there's Venom.
He loses his job because Peter rats him out for delivering fake photos to the Bugle, which is completely his fault, by the way. And then he loses his girl to Peter too, except Gwen is not his girl. She makes it pretty clear at the beginning of the movie that she's not into him.
And so his response to both of those situations is to walk into a church and pray for God to kill Peter Parker.
I want you to kill Peter Parker.
I will say the scene when the symbiote is falling off Peter in the church and falling onto Eddie is pretty sick. It's one of the coolest scenes in this movie. But once Eddie gets the symbiote, he starts saying some of the corniest lines imaginable.
Ooh, my spider sense is tingling. If you know what I'm talking about.
No, Eddie, I actually don't know what you're talking about. For Spider-Man 3, the villains get a 3.5. Next category is supporting characters. I think Spider-Man 1 does a great job at establishing everybody.
Uncle Ben being the emotional foundation for the whole trilogy. Harry's jealousy towards Peter is planted really well here. And Aunt May just brings so much warmth and wisdom to these movies.
She's literally Master Oogway if he was real. And then obviously J. Jonah Jameson is just perfect from the moment he appears. J.K. Simmons was literally born to play this role. And you probably noticed I'm leaving out a pretty big supporting character. And it's because she sucks. No, I actually think MJ gets way too much hate in these movies. She absolutely makes mistakes. In Spider-Man 1 specifically, she kisses Peter while she's dating Harry. But the way the internet treats her, you would think she's like working the street corner. If you actually pay attention to what happens with her in these movies, she kind of just goes through maybe 3 or 4 different relationships, if you want to count Flash as a relationship in the first movie, which is not that crazy. And yes, the way she handles most of the relationships she's in is not the greatest, but I feel like the movie goes out of its way to explain to the audience why she is the way she is. Her whole upbringing with her father is clearly what shapes her view of love and just how she handles her relationships. Now, that doesn't excuse everything that she does in these movies, but it does make her a lot more understandable. And I also think that people just let the Raimi movies define MJ as a character for them. If you've only seen the movies and haven't engaged in any other Spider-Man media, I can totally understand why you would be like, yo, hot take, Gwen is way better than MJ. I understand why people hate on Raimi's version of MJ. She's definitely one of the worst iterations of that character, but I also feel like the hate towards her is very overblown and over-exaggerated. I kind of get the vibe that some of y'all just don't like women. Harry is great in this movie also. His whole arc is built around wanting Norman's approval, and then Peter accidentally gets that father-son relationship that he has been craving his entire life. His resentment towards Peter is just so beautifully planted in this movie. The supporting characters of Spider-Man 1 get an 8.5. That resentment that was established in Spider-Man 1 beautifully translate to 2. This is where their friendship really starts to fall apart. And then again, MJ is kind of overhated in this movie. If you actually look at what happens in this movie through MJ's perspective, a lot of what she does makes a lot of sense. She doesn't know that Peter is Spider-Man. He literally friend-zoned her in the last movie, and now he's like acting like he wants to be with her again. So obviously she would be confused because she's already moved on. And Peter is just being a bad friend. He's not showing up for all the important stuff in her life. And of course that's because he's Spider-Man, but it's like she doesn't know that. That's not to say that MJ is perfect in this movie either. She literally leaves her fiance at the altar. Aunt May is just the GOAT of this movie. Her speech is one of my favorite scenes in any movie ever. And then her telling Peter about how she feels guilty and responsible for Uncle Ben's death, which in turn makes Peter feel even more guilty about the whole situation. There's just a lot of complex emotions that's displayed through these characters in these movies that you don't really see a lot of in the other 2 iterations. And then there's some smaller supporting characters like Mr. Dickovich and Ursula, which just add a lot of charm. J. Jonah Jameson just continues to be the undisputed GOAT of this trilogy. The supporting characters in Spider-Man 2 get a 9. For Spider-Man 3, I've basically already talked about what I want to talk about. The writing just doesn't give these characters enough room to breathe. Like, James Franco's performance and redemption at the end is good, but everything that sets it up is terrible. I kind of have that opinion with everything in this movie. Like, the end result is not that bad, but like the path to get there was just so incredibly messy and nonsensical. MJ gets a lot of blame for this movie too. Obviously, her cheating on Peter with Harry and going up to his apartment and kissing him is bad. She should have communicated her feelings more. But Peter isn't exactly innocent in this movie either. He kind of sucks. He is a huge reason as to why their relationship falls apart. And like I said, he starts acting like an asshole even before the symbiote attaches itself to him. Like, if you want to hate on MJ for kissing Harry, sure. But also, you might want to acknowledge how Peter did the exact same thing in the very beginning of the movie. He recreated the upside down kiss with Gwen in front of MJ, right after she just got fired from her dream job. And then Aunt May's okay in this movie, I guess. She doesn't really get a lot to do. And then Gwen Stacy just kind of exists as a plot device. She's not really a developed character. She's just here for relationship drama. J. Jonah Jameson is still great in this. He just doesn't get as much to do as he did in the first two. There's something that I didn't really talk about in supporting characters for the Raimi trilogy, and that is New York. I love how Sam Raimi makes New York feel like an actual character in these movies as opposed to a backdrop. I especially love all the street interview stuff in Spider-Man 1. I'm gonna bundle the next 3 categories together because they all kind of fall under filmmaking, and those are the visuals / cinematography, the action, fighting, and web swinging, and then the score / soundtrack. For Spider-Man 1, there's such a unique, distinct visual style, and so many shots that look like they were ripped straight out of a comic book. I feel like I'm going to say that a lot during this section. And then the color grading is just gorgeous. In terms of action, the final goblin fight is incredibly brutal. Raimi strips away the music, so all you can hear is the punches landing and the blood dripping off his face. You just don't see Peter get his ass handed to him like this in any other iteration of Spider-Man. And also, obviously, the battle damage suit just looks so cool. Tobey actually has a pretty distinct swinging style. It's very big and slow, like pendulum-like swings. And I think it fits beautifully with the score, which Danny Elfman's theme is just fantastic. It just feels so huge and triumphant. For Spider-Man 1, the visuals get a 10, the action gets a 9.5, and the score gets a 9. Now, Spider-Man 2, this is definitely one of the best looking comic book movies ever made. There's so many incredible transitions. I know the one that comes out of Doc Ock's eye is like the famous one, but on my last rewatch, I noticed so many other ones that are so cool. And there's even more shots in this one that look like they were ripped straight out of a comic book. The clock tower scene is really cool, and then obviously the train scene is one of the best superhero scenes ever made. And then the score / soundtrack, it's kind of the same exact theme from the first movie, except I feel like this one gets a slight edge because it has a few cool needle drops, and the songs don't make this movie feel outdated, unlike a few other Spider-Man movies, which we'll get to later in this video. For visuals and action, Spider-Man 2 gets a 10. For the score, it gets 9.5. Now for Spider-Man 3, even though the writing takes a huge step back, I don't think that the filmmaking does. Sam Raimi's fingerprints are still all over this movie. I think the Sandman VFX and CGI looks amazing. And then every single shot with the black suit is just drenched in aura. And all of the action is still really good too. The first fight that Peter has with Harry is pretty cool. The CGI, again, is pretty good. It's also just really cool to see Peter doing Spidey stuff without the suit on. And then Sandman's powers lead to some pretty cool action scenes. The underground subway fight is another example of how brutal some of the fights get in these movies. And the final battle is still super badass despite everything that led up to it. And I love how every Tobey movie ends with the suit absolutely ripped to shreds. This man is probably repairing that thing every weekend. The score is still incredibly strong. Sandman's theme is very underrated. I feel like nobody talks about it. And the black suit theme is awesome. I feel like if you judge Spider-Man 3 purely on just presentation and sauce, it belongs right alongside the other two. The visuals and action of Spider-Man 3 get a 9, and then the score gets a 9.5. The next category is probably the biggest criticism that I have for Tobey's Spider-Man as a whole, and that is the quips / humor. Spider-Man is supposed to be a smartass. That's a huge part of the character. Peter spends most of his life shy, awkward, and unable to say what he's actually thinking. But then when he puts on the mask, he becomes a chatterbox all of a sudden. Spider-Man is like an outlet for Peter. He jokes during his fights, not just to throw off his villains, but also to hide his own fear and to cope with the fact that he's constantly almost dying. And that's something about Spider-Man that I've always found super relatable. When I'm around people I don't know very well, I'm usually pretty quiet, but when I'm around a few of my closest friends, or I'm doing something like this where I'm making a video, suddenly all the yapping and the joking comes out. I also heavily relate to using humor or cracking dumb jokes during stressful, awkward, or just serious situations. And my problem with Tobey Spider-Man is that he just barely quips at all. Specifically in Spider-Man 1, I counted 3 actual quips.
Nice costume. Did your husband give it to you? Hey kiddo, let mom and dad talk for a minute. That's probably the best one. And then, it's you who's out, Gobby.
out of your mind.
And that's probably one of the worst Spider-Man quips, not only in this movie, but just in general. But yeah, none of those are particularly clever or delivered with much confidence. Even when he does joke as Spider-Man, he still sounds like the quiet, awkward, soft-spoken Peter Parker. All of the humor that does work in this movie comes from somewhere else, like J. Jonah Jameson, or just Peter being awkward, or just the unapologetically campy style of this movie as a whole. So for quips / humor, I'll give Spider-Man 1 a 4.5. For Spider-Man 2, the quips unfortunately don't really improve. I still only counted 3 quips.
Rides up in the crotch a little. Here's your change, and I have a knack for that, which I don't even know if you can count that one as a quip, to be honest.
One thing that really annoys me is how many opportunities Peter gets to crack a joke, and then he just doesn't.
We sure showed him.
What do you mean we?
Oh.
I do think that the overall humor of this movie is better than the first one, though. I think a lot of that has to do with Mr. Dickovich and more scenes with J. Jonah Jameson. But also, Peter is just constantly getting embarrassed. And also, you got lines like pizza time.
Pizza time.
And oh boy, yeah.
I liked seeing you tonight, Peter.
Oh boy, yeah.
Which are just all-timers if you ask me. So Spider-Man 2 gets a 5.5. I think Spider-Man 3 is definitely the funniest of the trilogy, but not really for the reasons that I think they were intending. The actual Spider-Man quips are still pretty weak.
Jigs up, pal. I'm the sheriff around these parts, and where do all these guys come from? Which again, I don't even know if you can count that as a quip.
Almost all the iconic lines come from Bully Maguire.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye. Now dig on this. See ya, chump. Look at little Goblin Jr.
Gonna cry.
The entire Bully Maguire plot feels like an SNL sketch that somehow ended up in the actual movie. I do think that nostalgia and just memes are doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, but at the end of the day, if I'm laughing, I'm laughing. It's a great one to throw on with a group of friends. So for humor and quips, Spider-Man 3 gets a 6.5. Next category is suit design. Now, there's not a lot to talk about here because it doesn't really change throughout the whole trilogy. The Tobey suit has never particularly been my favorite Spider-Man suit, but I will say it looks so tangible, especially in all like the close-up practical shots where you can tell it's not CGI. The raised silver webbing gives this suit a very unique and iconic look. I also think the more angular lenses fit the Raimi style very well. You just never see Peter actually making this suit. He just kind of shows up one day with a multi-million-dollar Hollywood superhero costume. Regardless, the Tobey suit in Spider-Man 1 gets an 8. Now Spider-Man 2, it's basically the exact same suit. I think the back logo did change slightly, but unless you're some kind of super nerd like somebody who would watch all the Spider-Man movies and then grade them all on this really specific grading rubric like you're a college professor, unless you're some weirdo like that, I don't think you're gonna notice it. So this one also is gonna get an 8. For Spider-Man 3, again, it's the same exact suit. I'm pretty sure the back logo changes again, but this movie has the black suit. And I can understand if you don't really like the black suit and just think it's a lazy redesign, because it is just the same suit basically, but black. The symbiote suit that they were planning on going with originally does look a lot cooler and more accurate to the comics, but I still really like this one. Spider-Man 3 suit design gets an 8.5. With great power comes great rewatchability. I think Spider-Man 1 has aged incredibly well. A lot of people will say that the Raimi trilogy is heavily carried by nostalgia, which is something I do not agree with, especially with this movie. Sam Raimi's style just gives this movie so much personality, and it still stands out over 20 years later. If you really think about it, there's very few comic book movies that have come out that have come close to the levels of sauce that these movies have. The one thing that I think has not aged the best is the Green Goblin suit. If this Goblin suit debuted today, people would absolutely clown on it. Imagine if Dafoe's version of Goblin never existed, and then the Sam Raimi Green Goblin suit showed up in a Tom Holland MCU Spider-Man movie. It would probably be nanotech or something, and everyone would be screaming Iron Boy Jr. again. Because of just how well made this movie is and how great William Dafoe's performance is, the suit somehow becomes charming instead of distracting. So I definitely don't think that nostalgia carries this movie, but it does help smooth over a few rough edges like the Green Goblin suit. Spider-Man 1 gets a 9.5. Spider-Man 2 has aged even better than Spider-Man 1. This is one of those movies that I'm excited to show my future children. That's how timeless it is. It gets a 10. Spider-Man 3, I feel like you already know where this is going. I feel like a lot of the defenders of this movie, a lot of what they love is just the memes. I don't think nostalgia carries this trilogy. It's not the only reason why these movies are so beloved. But with this one, I kind of see where people are coming from. Bully Maguire is hilarious, but let's be honest. If Tom Holland or Andrew Garfield did that exact same thing now, people would absolutely tear it to shreds. It would be called one of the worst superhero movies of all time. That being said though, I don't think this movie has aged too terribly bad. It's a hot mess, but it's an entertaining hot mess. The black suit scenes still go hard, and the Sandman VFX still holds up to this day. It's better than some CGI that's coming out now. It's nowhere near as timeless as the first two, but it's still aged better than it probably had the right to. Spider-Man 3 gets a 6. All right, like I said in the beginning of this video, the last two categories are not going to actually count towards the final score. They're just going to be for fun, and those categories are the Peter Parker suffering meter and comic accuracy. Now, Spider-Man 1 is definitely jam-packed with Peter Parker suffering.
Uncle Ben dies, Goblin terrorizes Aunt May, he watches his best friend's father die in front of him, and then he has to deliver his friend's dad's corpse to his friend's house. And then on top of that, he has to reject his lifelong crush because he just wants her to be safe.
This man just can't catch a break. So Spider-Man 1 gets an 8.5 on the Peter suffering meter. Spider-Man 2, this is just an even better example of this.
He's broke, he can't pay his rent, he's constantly getting fired, he's falling behind in college. MJ is starting to dislike him, even as a friend. His best friend hates him, and he's still carrying the guilt of Uncle Ben, which is compounded by the guilt of Aunt May. And then even after giving up Spider-Man, he still can't escape the responsibility and consequences.
This one gets a 9 on the Peter Parker suffering meter. The only reason why it's not a 10 is because nobody really dies, and he gets the girl at the end. Also, there's better examples of Peter suffering in later movies, which we'll get to. Spider-Man 3, Peter's actually doing pretty well, at least for the first half.
He's getting ready to propose to MJ, New York loves him, and Harry has conveniently forgotten that he's responsible for his father's death.
It's a weird feeling not knowing who you are.
In my head.
But once stuff starts to go downhill, most of his problems are self-inflicted, and he also ends up with MJ at the end. This one gets a 3. Now it's time for comic accuracy. I feel like this is a very hot debate amongst Spider-Man fans. Just a disclaimer, I am definitely not the most well-equipped person to speak on all this. I've read a decent amount of comics, but not enough to actually know what I'm talking about. I feel like the Raimi movies have kind of become the default definition of who Spider-Man is for a lot of people. A lot of the times when people say that the newer versions of Spider-Man aren't comic accurate, I feel like a lot of the times what they actually mean is that these movies are not identical to the same Raimi version. I honestly kind of understand why that is. These movies are just classics and a lot of people grew up with them. And before I started reading some comics, I also thought that the same Raimi trilogy was just 100% accurate to the source material because it just feels like Spider-Man. But I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that these movies are also adaptations. And a lot of the changes that they made are the reasons why these movies actually work and are as good as they are. Comic accuracy is a lot more complicated than people try to make it seem like. There's been over 60 years of Spider-Man comics, hundreds of writers and alternate universes, each with their own different iteration of the character. So just based off statistics, almost any story that you tried to tell could technically be considered comic accurate because there's just so much source material to pull from. For example, there's a Spider-Man story where Mary Jane is married to Peter Parker and she develops cancer from years of exposure to Spider-Man's radioactive bodily fluid. She got cum cancer. So if Sony decided tomorrow that they were going to make Spider-Man 4 with Tobey Maguire, where they adapted that storyline, it would technically be comic accurate. But does that mean it would be a very good movie? I'm sure a lot of people would be cheering the way some of y'all treat Sam Raimi's MJ.
Yeah, she got cum cancer, let's go.
Point is, the goal of being comic accurate should not just be copying everything beat for beat from the comics. It should be to keep the core foundation of the character, keep what does work, and then change what doesn't work, and just try to create something new and fresh while still feeling like Spider-Man. So I think in that sense, the Raimi trilogy definitely nails comic accuracy. I think Spider-Man 1 specifically does a really good job at adapting the classic Stan Lee and Steve Ditko original origin. It modernizes it very well while still keeping the campy comic book charm. And it doesn't try to make everything feel overly realistic. It doesn't take itself too seriously. I think the only thing that's not really that comic accurate is just the way Peter is in high school. For the first 30-ish issues of the comics, Peter is kind of a hothead. He's super cocky and sarcastic and thinks he's smarter than everybody else around him. He's still a nerd that gets bullied, but he honestly kind of deserves it the way that he treats people. And Tobey's Peter kind of skips that whole high school arc completely. Right from the jump, he's much quieter, awkward, shy, and kind of a pushover, to be honest. And that definitely makes his Peter more immediately likable, but it also kind of skips a large portion of his high school arc that he had in the comics. Then there's some other obvious things like the organic webs and Green Goblin's Power Rangers suit. And then another funny example of inaccuracy is Uncle Ben saying the "with great power comes great responsibility" line. Because in the very first Spider-Man comic, Amazing Fantasy 15, Uncle Ben doesn't actually say that line. It's just a narration box on the last page. So later adaptations, including this one, decided to change that and make Uncle Ben say that line. Sometimes changing the source material makes the story stronger. Spider-Man 1 is technically inaccurate in a lot of ways, but in terms of just getting the heart of the character down, it does it very well. So if I had to give it a score, score, based off my very limited knowledge of comics, by the way, please don't kill me if you're a comic Nazi, I would give this a 7.5. Spider-Man 2 is kind of the same thing. It gets the heart of the character very accurate, pulls a lot of inspiration from the Spider-Man No More run of comics, and it doesn't adapt that story beat for beat. It does take the core idea from that story, which is, what if Peter Parker starts questioning whether or not it's worth it to be Spider-Man? And Dr. Octopus differs a little bit from his original origin. Obviously, he's a lot less of a cartoon character like evil mad scientist. Again, with my limited knowledge, there's not a lot I can point to that's inaccurate. So I'll give this one a 9 out of 10. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Sandman's origin and stuff, but I do think that the retcon of him being the one that killed Uncle Ben is really stupid. I just personally choose to ignore that writing decision. To me, that's not canon. Like I said before, comic book Peter was very arrogant and cocky and kind of lashed out at people sometimes. And this movie gives Tobey some of those traits. So technically, this Peter Parker is kind of comic accurate in ways that the first two movies didn't capture. The problem is he's already gone through character development. He's out of high school. And I haven't read too many comics involving Venom, but I know that this is not how Venom is supposed to be. So I guess Spider-Man 3 gets a 5 out of 10. All right, now I'm gonna talk about who seems to have become everyone's favorite Spider-Man ever since No Way Home came out. And that is Andrew Garfield and the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Starting with the writing, for TASM 1, I think the basic storyline and just structure is actually pretty solid. I think my biggest issue is that it just spends so much time trying way too hard to differentiate itself from the Raimi trilogy. And a lot of it is just change for the sake of change. It's not creative reinvention. I do like how much time this movie spends giving Uncle Ben an actual personality. I'm not the biggest fan though of how much time this movie spends with Peter seeking revenge. Peter spends what feels like weeks tracking down Uncle Ben's killer, and then that storyline just kind of awkwardly ends. There's not really a moment where Peter stops and reflects on the anger that was fueling his actions like there was in the Tobey movies, and he never even finds the guy he was looking for. That whole plot just kind of fizzles out, and then he immediately moves on to the Lizard. I think Uncle Ben's death scene is a little bit messy. The "not my policy" line feels so forced. It's just an obvious worse version of "I missed the part where that's my problem."
You can leave a penny anytime. You have to spend $10 to take a penny.
Store policy. Little help. Not my policy.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Also, the store clerk expecting Peter to run down and stop an armed robber for him makes no sense. He doesn't know that Peter has superhuman powers. He's just a random high school kid to him. Why would he expect him to do that? And then Uncle Ben just randomly tackles the guy with the gun. He didn't know the context of the situation at all. He just sees a random guy drop his gun on the street, and his first instinct is to throw himself on top of it. When you compare it to Raimi's origin story, it just feels very copy my homework but don't make it too obvious type thing. And also the parent subplot just doesn't really do anything for me. And that opening scene with Peter as a kid feels like it belongs in Batman Begins, not a Spider-Man movie. And the Lizard is also pretty underdeveloped. His whole motivation at the beginning is all right. It's just a scientist wanting to grow his arm back, and then he just suddenly flips a switch and becomes a reptile Nazi wanting to turn the whole world into lizards. I wish they would have kept the deleted scenes with him and his family, because that would have made him way more in line with the tragic, sympathetic character that Dr. Connors is supposed to be. One of my biggest problems with this movie in terms of writing is the ending when Peter breaks his promise that he made to Captain Stacy. Like I said, Spider-Man 2 kind of made a similar mistake at the end, but at least that was MJ's choice. And I get they wanted to hint at him getting back with Gwen at the end so they could set it up for the next movie, but I just feel like there was probably a more graceful way to do it, instead of him just being like, I know I made a promise to your dead dad and everything, but I thought about it and I actually don't really care anymore. I'm still gonna date you, and you're probably gonna die because of it. I know it sounds like I hated on this movie a lot, but I still really do like it. It's just weighed down by a few random subplots and unnecessary changes that don't necessarily improve on what came before it. So for writing, I'm gonna give TASM 1 a 7. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, this is probably one of the most frustrating Spider-Man movies when it comes to writing. Similarly to Spider-Man 3, one of its biggest problems is just trying to do way too many things.
Peter and Gwen's relationship, Electro, Harry and the Herpes Goblin, Oscorp conspiracy, the parent subplot, the Sinister Six setup.
My least favorite part of this movie is definitely Harry. He's randomly shoehorned in like they suddenly remembered that they needed to have Goblin. And they try to convince us that him and Peter are lifelong friends, but it's very hard to believe.
You got your braces on.
There's nothing to distract from your unibrow.
His whole hereditary disease thing doesn't really make much sense.
He says he's dying, so he tells Peter he needs Spider-Man's blood. So Peter's like, okay, I'll track him down and see what I can do for you. And then he shows up as Spider-Man just to tell Harry no, and then immediately leaves.
What was even the point of that?
You're a fraud, Spider-Man!
And then the spider venom turns him into Herpes Goblin, and he teams up with Electro, which I'll complain about a lot more when I get to villains, don't worry. I've done a lot of complaining, but I do think Andrew and Gwen's romance are the heart of this movie. Same thing with the first movie too. Despite the ending of the first movie, I think the whole conflict with Peter breaking Captain Stacy's promise and him wrestling with that decision works really well in this movie. And then when Gwen dies, it finally gives that choice real consequences. And then I just love the end with
Peter listening to Gwen's graduation speech about hope, and then also his talk with Aunt May and how she dealt with the trauma from Uncle Ben, and all of that inspires him to swoop back in as Spider-Man and save the kid that he helped out earlier in the movie dressed up as Spider-Man.
It might be my favorite ending in any Spider-Man movie, to be honest. Unfortunately, everything surrounding the parent subplot gets so much worse in this one. It contributes nothing to the actual story. Electro blacks out the city, we get our big CGI climax, and then it just kind of forgets about the whole parent thing. But the whole writing choice to have Peter uncover this massive Oscorp conspiracy by throwing a calculator against the wall, which breaks open, revealing some magical coins that grant him access to this underground subway station laboratory. It's actually so laughable how convenient that whole part is. And then the whole thing with Peter being genetically destined to become Spider-Man is so lame. And it just takes away from the whole idea of anyone can wear the mask. I love Gwen's death. It's like a top 3 all-timer Spider-Man moment. But imagine how much harder it would have hit if the movie wasn't constantly juggling like 15 different side plots. There's so many amazing Spider-Man moments in this movie. I just wish they lived inside a better and more organized story. There's definitely a reason nobody talks about the writing or the story when they're glazing this movie. They can only ever mention the action and the web swinging and how the CGI just looks so good. The MCU could never. And to be fair, all of those moments deserve their praise. All I'm saying is you never hear anyone say, wow, TASM 2 has such a great screenplay. All right, for Peter Parker's performance / portrayal, this is a touchy subject because a lot of people hate Andrew's Peter Parker and a lot of people love it. For The Amazing Spider-Man 1, a lot of people's biggest criticism is that Andrew is just way too cool to play Peter Parker. And I can definitely see where people are coming from with that, but I don't really care personally. I don't think it should bother people as much as it does. Call me crazy, but super minor details like the fact that Peter skateboards and wears panda dunks doesn't completely ruin the entire movie for me. The one thing that I will give you is that Peter has way too much riz. He should definitely be more awkward with girls than he is. My bigger issue with this version of Peter is that the movie also wants you to believe that he's this bullied, misunderstood social outcast. You cannot convince me that over half the girls in that school would not be drenching their capris over indie photographer, skater boy, Andrew Garfield. Yeah, he gets bullied by Flash, but like, they could easily trade places. They both have equal amounts of swag. I do love how they actually show Peter's intelligence in this one with how he makes his own web shooters and his own suit, and how he helps Dr. Connors with his formula, instead of just having Peter spew out random science buzzwords.
The applause wasn't very loud.
Yes, it was. It's the acoustics.
It's all about diffusion. It keeps the sound waves from grouping. You see, when the sound waves, they propagate, then it's like an...
Obviously, performance-wise, Andrew Garfield is phenomenal. And I know some people prefer Tobey's more awkward portrayal of Peter, and that's fair. But purely as an actor, I don't even think it's close. Andrew has so much more emotional range. I think Andrew is a great Peter Parker. I just feel like the writing occasionally sends mixed signals about who this version of the character is supposed to be. Andrew's Peter gets an 8.5. In TASM 2, I think Andrew completely owns the role by this point. His chemistry with Emma Stone does a lot of heavy lifting. Their relationship feels very natural because, well, they were actually in a relationship in real life. And Gwen's death scene is one of Andrew's best acting performances and just one of the best performances in any Spider-Man movie ever. Back to the Andrew is too cool argument, I can definitely see where you're coming from when that graduation scene exists. That's a little bit too much in my opinion. I think he is a huge reason as to why this movie's reputation has changed so much after No Way Home came out. When that movie came out, people didn't just suddenly discover that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is this secret masterpiece. If you actually believe that, I think there's something deeply wrong with you. No Way Home just reminded everyone of something that a lot of us already knew. Andrew Garfield is just a pretty damn good actor. And maybe he wasn't the reason why this movie was so incredibly mid. It was just everything else surrounding him. TASM 2, Peter Parker gets a 9. And now it's time for villains. The Lizard and Amazing Spider-Man 1 is just fine to me. Like I said in writing, he's just a very underdeveloped character and they didn't tap into the things that actually make his character interesting from the comics. He also just kind of feels like reheated Green Goblin nachos a lot of the times. They were both rushed into human testing and then they took a mysterious serum and then turned into an evil green guy that has a split personality and talks to themselves. And also the Lizard's design is just straight up cheeks. Why did they make his face so flat? But I don't necessarily think he's the worst. I do like how Peter is technically responsible for creating him, so it ties in well with the theme of responsibility.
Poor Peter Parker.
No mother, no father.
No uncle, no brother, no sister, no cousins.
No, bitches.
The Lizard gets a 6.5. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, these are hands down my least favorite live action Spider-Man villains. And I feel like I speak for everyone with that take. There's a reason why nobody ever mentions the villains when they're glazing this movie. I think Electro actually has some potential to be somewhat interesting. The idea of this super isolated, mentally ill guy that was obsessed with Spider-Man could have been cool, but the execution was just terrible. Jamie Foxx does a terrible job at convincing you that he's a social outcast. And once he becomes Electro, it feels like he's acting in a completely different movie. Some of his lines are just so corny, and not in like a charmingly campy way either. They're just bad. His entire villain arc happens because Spider-Man doesn't recognize him in Times Square. Brother, he literally met you one time, and I don't know if you noticed, but you're blue now. Not to mention, somehow the radioactive electric eels got rid of your hairline and fused your gap tooth together. And also remember, we're supposed to feel bad for Electro. He dies in an explosion at Peter Parker's hands, by the way, just so we can speed run into Green Goblin killing Gwen Stacy. And Peter doesn't even stop for a moment to reflect on the fact that he just disintegrated a human being that used to look up to him. Also, you simply just can't argue that he's a good villain when they literally made the decision in No Way Home to just completely change his character. Harry is somehow even worse. He's practically irrelevant until the final battle. All of a sudden the movie's like, oh yeah, I forgot, Harry's supposed to turn into Green Goblin. And then they just speedrun his entire arc in like 10 minutes. I actually do think his transformation scene is kind of cool, but the end result is one of the worst adaptations of a villain ever. I think the villains are obviously the worst part of this movie. They get a 1. On to supporting characters. I actually think The Amazing Spider-Man 1 is the best in terms of all the live action Spider-Man movies. I think this is the best live action Uncle Ben, the best love interest, close to the best Aunt May. I just feel like she doesn't get enough to do. And also the speech in Spider-Man 2 exists, and that's kind of unbeatable. So you see Uncle Ben interact with Peter and Aunt May way more. I actually like his responsibility lesson and his whole speech more than I do the Tobey movies. I love at the end when Peter is listening to his voicemail. Andrew and Emma's chemistry is just ridiculous. Sometimes a little bit too ridiculous, honestly. Get a room, sheesh. I also like how Gwen is actually useful in these movies. She actually contributes to the story. She's not just a plot device waiting around to get rescued. And also, even though the competition is not that great with the other two, this is easily my favorite Flash Thompson. He's not just a stereotypical Disney Channel bully, he actually has some sort of character development. And Marc Webb continues the Sam Raimi tradition of making New York actually feel like its own character. So supporting characters for TASM 1 gets a 10. I think The Amazing Spider-Man 1 takes a small step back with supporting characters. Don't get me wrong, Gwen is still incredible. Their chemistry is still just as strong, if not stronger. And Sally Field continues to be a great Aunt May. The You're My Boy scene with her and Peter is one of the most heartfelt scenes in the whole movie. I guess the only other main supporting character would be Harry before he turns into a gremlin. I just don't buy his relationship to Peter at all. And I don't know if it's just his haircut or just the way he delivers lines, but on my last rewatch, I was audibly sighing every single time he opened his mouth.
My manservant works the hairdryer.
But I work the comb.
He makes me want to rip my nuts off and launch them at the screen. All right, now for the filmmaking categories, visuals, action, and soundtrack all bundled together. For The Amazing Spider-Man 1, I think the biggest strength visually is just Andrew himself. He actually moves and feels like a spider. His swinging is just so agile and acrobatic. He's constantly flipping and crawling and making different web traps and web cocoons. The action overall is pretty solid. There's nothing like incredibly iconic, but there's also not really a single weak fighting scene in this movie. The one standout scene for me is when he rescues that kid from the falling burning car and he has him put on the mask, and then later on the dad of that kid helps him out with the cranes. Both very underrated scenes, to be honest. And like a lot of people talk about, the CGI is pretty great. I'm just not a huge fan of like the darker, grittier aesthetic. This was during the era where every superhero movie wanted to be the Dark Knight. There's also just not as many shots that instantly stick in my head the way the Raimi trilogy does. And before any of you Tobey haters scream at me and say that's only because of nostalgia, I also grew up with these movies. I was 9 years old when this movie came out. I really enjoyed these movies as a kid, and I still do. So no, it's not just because of nostalgia. This movie is just not as saucy as the Raimi trilogy, okay? Get over it. And the soundtrack is also great. I love the James Horner theme. It feels very heroic. Maybe it's not as grand or theatrical as the Elfman theme, but it just feels a lot more Spider-Man to me. For TASM 1, visuals get a 6.5, action gets an 8.5, and the score gets a 9. For TASM 2, I completely ignore that opening scene with the parents in the plane. That doesn't exist to me. The real opening scene is him swinging in with the Hans Zimmer score. The suit just just looks so colorful in his acrobatic swinging. Everything overall is a lot more bright and colorful. And Electro might not be the best villain, but visually he creates a lot of awesome looking action scenes. The soundtrack is great. Hans Zimmer is the GOAT. I love the piano motif with him and Gwen and how it plays at the end when she dies. The soundtrack does have a problem with dated needle drops. I hate that they decided to put that Philip Phillips song in this movie. It just feels so 2014 in the worst way possible. So for TASM 2, visuals get an 8.5, action gets a 9, and the score gets a 9.5. All right, now it's time for quips and humor. This is where Andrew's movies really stand out from Tobey's. We finally get a Spider-Man that actually cracks some jokes. For The Amazing Spider-Man 1, I think the car thief scene is the best example of this. My only problem with that scene is that he's also kind of being a jerk. He's interrogating that guy not because he's trying to be a hero and help people, but because he's chasing revenge. So while the quips are great, it's attached to this version of Peter that feels less like Spider-Man and more like Christian Bale's Batman. But outside of that, I like, I'm swinging here, and somebody's been a bad lizard. And then aside from the quips, there's a lot of funny moments in this movie, like Uncle Ben teasing Peter about Gwen. And then also Andrew and Gwen's dynamic create a few comedic moments too. For TASM 2, this is probably the closest we've gotten to Spider-Man's sense of humor.
He's constantly quipping and messing with Rhino, talking to cops, working with the firefighters, and helping out random kids with their science projects.
It just feels so friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And then there's also some other funny scenes like I was washing the American flag and we don't have a chimney. The only thing that's holding the quips back in this movie is that sometimes the writing kind of undercuts them a bit, like in the Rhino scene where Andrew is cracking jokes the whole time while dozens of cars are getting obliterated. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen that clip of that guy dissecting this entire scene.
This is your guys' goat, by the way. I'm gonna be right back. Let's count how many families we think died. All right, here we go. Ready? Bow. That person is dead!
Yeah, it's kind of hard to defend it, but it's usually just something that I try to ignore when rewatching this movie, because it's pretty obvious that whoever was in charge of this scene was just trying to cram as much action as possible into it. They weren't necessarily trying to communicate to the audience that Spider-Man is purposely letting all these people die and that he doesn't care. The villains are unintentionally funny in this movie, but that's just because of the poor writing. Quips and humor for TASM 2 gets an 8.5. Now on to Spider-Man's suit design. TASM 1 is probably my least favorite live action suit. It's probably the most realistic suit. It feels like something that Peter could actually make, but I don't necessarily think that realistic equals better. I think my biggest issue is just all the unnecessary lines and textures. And then having the eyes be made from sunglass lenses is pretty cool in theory. The yellow lenses have just never worked for me. And I've even seen people make edits where they just take the TASM 1 suit and make the lenses white, and it looks miles better. So like, why didn't they just have Andrew spray paint the sunglass lenses white or something? It's just different for the sake of being different. Andrew's physique definitely carries a lot. His more slender build definitely complements the more athletic look with the suit. And all the shots where the suit looks the best, it's usually in really dark lighting. But if your suit only looks kind of good when I can barely see it, that's not a really good sign. And then his homemade suit, if you can even call it a suit, is probably the most boring and lazy suit design in all of Spider-Man. The TASM 1 suit gets a 3.5, but we get a massive glow up with the Amazing Spider-Man 2 suit. He's got huge expressive white eyes, brighter colors, no unnecessary lines or textures. It just looks like Spider-Man. Also, the suit paired with Andrew's swinging style makes for some of the best scenes in any Spider-Man media ever. This is my current favorite live action Spider-Man suit, unless Brand New Day tops it. And I know we've already seen it with the trailers that we've gotten, but I want to wait until I've seen the entire movie all the way through. So obviously the Amazing Spider-Man 2 suit gets a 10. Now on to rewatchability and just how well these movies have aged. For the longest time, the Amazing Spider-Man 1 was treated like the unnecessary reboot, but nowadays with Andrew Garfield's Hayden Christensen-like resurgence and him being a lot of people's favorite Spider-Man, I think the pendulum has swung a little bit too far in the opposite direction. A lot of people have kind of forgotten why this movie was so criticized in the first place. It was never Andrew himself. It was criticized for all the stuff that I've already kind of talked about, but I personally do still like coming back to this movie. It's always a fun rewatch. I think my one complaint would be it just doesn't have that timeless comfort movie feel that the Raimi trilogy had. Even though I also grew up with this version of Spider-Man, it just doesn't hit me with that same feeling. Watching the Raimi trilogy feels like eating freshly baked cookies, and watching The Amazing Spider-Man feels like eating Chips Ahoy. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too harsh. It feels like eating the softer baked Chips Ahoy. Those are better. So I'll give TASM 1 a 6.5. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, this one can honestly be a pretty exhausting watch. Not because it's boring necessarily, but just because it gives me extreme whiplash. It'll go from some of the best Spider-Man scenes ever to some of the worst. over and over again, back and forth. And that's why I've never really understood why people say this is one of their favorite Spider-Man movies. I completely understand all the people that love the high points of this movie. I do too. But when I sit down to rewatch it, I don't really know what to do during the low parts. To me, the best movies are enjoyable all the way through. And TASM 2 feels like watching a compilation of incredible Spider-Man moments that are interrupted every few minutes with stuff like this.
One of my manservants holds the hairdryer.
But I work the comb, okay?
Similarly to TASM 1, but on an extreme level, I feel like a lot of people have just forgotten why this movie was criticized in the first place. Yes, Andrew is phenomenal, and there's a handful of really good scenes in this movie, but that doesn't mean that all the terrible scenes don't exist. So TASM 2 gets a 4 for rewatchability. Now on to the Peter suffering meter. For TASM 1, I don't think Peter suffers that much in the grand scheme of Spider-Man suffrage.
He loses his parents in the beginning, and he loses Uncle Ben, obviously. He has to break up with Gwen after making a promise to her dad, and he's also the reason why her dad died.
So he definitely goes to the ringer, just not as brutal as some other Spider-Man movies. I'll give this one an 8. Now TASM 2, he's wrestling with the promise that he made to Gwen Stacy's dad for basically the whole movie. It doesn't just ignore the ending of the last movie and move on. It actually shows Peter wrestling with that decision and dealing with the guilt. And then the worst case scenario happens. Gwen dies, and it's completely his fault. But outside of that, he doesn't really go through that much. I guess you could count Harry's stuff as him suffering, because that's his best friend, but he does suffer a lot in this movie, so he gets a 9. Now on to comic accuracy. If you completely skipped the Tobey stuff and you just wanted to see what I had to say about Andrew, I kind of already talked about this, but I am definitely not qualified that much to talk about comic accuracy. I don't really know what I'm talking about. Now the Amazing Spider-Man 1 is kind of tricky because, for example, I always thought that the parent subplot was something that the movies just made up, but apparently it is from some comics, but they're more like obscure. It's stuff that main continuity writers kind of just ignore. So technically that whole subplot is comic accurate. Do I think they handled it very well though? No. Andrew's version of Spider-Man takes a lot more inspiration from the Ultimate Universe of Marvel Comics rather than the traditional Silver Age Stan Lee stuff. A big example that I've noticed personally is Peter's relationship to Uncle Ben. It feels a lot closer to that series. Even his death and the whole responsibility situation is basically pulled word for word from that comic. Also, Andrew has web shooters and he's way more quippy than Tobey. There's a few changes I'm not too crazy about though, like the whole spider bite being part of an Oscorp conspiracy as opposed to just being a random accident on a field trip. It feels a lot less like this could happen to anyone. And Peter himself, like I already talked about, is kind of a weird blend. He's still a sarcastic nerd, but the movie also paints him as this angsty skater kid at the same time. So TASM 1 gets a 7 for comic accuracy. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is kind of all over the place. The biggest thing that it gets correct is obviously Gwen Stacy's death. It's not only one of the most iconic moments in Spider-Man's history, but just in comic book history in general. It was the first time that someone's love interest actually died. And I think the movie adapts her death amazingly. It's kind of the best part of this movie. Harry becoming Green Goblin because of some made-up genetic disease instead of just wanting to avenge his father is really silly. And then instead of being a blue-collar worker, Electro was rewritten as this mentally ill Spider-Man superfan. You might not think it, but Electro's design actually is technically comic accurate. It's not to the classic Electro design. He's more in line with the Ultimate Universe of Electro, like a lot of other things in these movies. Other than the whole thing with Peter being genetically predestined to be Spider-Man, I think this movie gets Spider-Man decently right, but everything else takes some pretty huge liberties, so I'll just give this one a 5, I guess. I ran out of Spider-Man shirts, okay? Leave me alone. Now we're going to be talking about Tom Holland's Spider-Man trilogy. Starting with the writing with his first movie, Spider-Man Homecoming. I am a huge defender of this movie. I will never understand why its very few flaws somehow cancel out everything good about it. Meanwhile, the absolute atrocities that Marc Webb committed in TASM 2 get brushed aside just because Andrew is a likable guy and he's a good actor and his swinging looks cool. I think a lot of people criticize this movie just because it's so different. Marvel skipped the traditional Uncle Ben origin story because we had already seen it twice in a span of 15 years. When this movie was announced, everyone was like, bro, we seriously have to watch Uncle Ben die for a third time? And so they decided to skip it. But fast forward to now, and everybody criticizes it for doing exactly that. But I think rebooting Spider-Man as this coming-of-age high school comedy movie was a very good decision. I think it was the right call. It carved out its own identity as a Spider-Man movie instead of trying to just imitate what came before it. Not every Spider-Man story has to be identical. That's kind of the whole point in rebooting the character. There would be no reason to even have this debate if they were all the same. The laziest, most recycled, regurgitated take I hear about this movie is that Tom is Iron Boy Jr. and he relies on Tony too much. Now, I completely understand if your personal preferred version of Spider-Man is not attached to something like the MCU where he's involved with all these other heroes. But also, this was the first Spider-Man to be in the MCU. That was kind of the whole appeal, was that he interacted with other characters in the MCU, because he's in the MCU. Also, the whole Iron Boy Jr. thing kind of misses the entire point of the movie. Just admit that you were scrolling reels and weren't paying attention, because I don't know how it's physically possible to watch this movie and not instantly pick up on the arc that they were trying to tell. Peter spends a lot of the movie trying to become an Avenger because he's a 15-year-old kid and he's in a universe where superheroes are kind of a common thing, and becoming an Avenger is like the only way he thinks that he can become a real hero or prove himself. But by the end of the movie, he realizes that he doesn't need the fancy Stark suit to be a hero. He defeats Vulture and saves his life, by the way, in his homemade suit, and then he literally turns down Tony's Avengers offer. Also, people act like RDJ is the co-star of this movie. Meanwhile, he has like maybe 7 minutes of screen time. I also think the lower stakes work in this movie's favor. It's a lot more grounded. It's a lot more friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, which people act like we've never gotten with Tom's Spider-Man, but we have. It's this movie. The pacing is also just fantastic. It's very heartfelt and it never really drags, to be honest. The writing for Homecoming gets a 9. I am a day one defender of Homecoming, but Far From Home is the definition of mid. As a movie, it's actually pretty good, but as a Spider-Man movie, it's definitely the most forgettable. I feel like a lot of the criticisms that people throw at Homecoming actually apply way more to Far From Home. Tom is somehow even more Iron Boy Jr. in this one, and Tony Stark is literally dead. And then Mysterio is another Stark related villain, and then Peter literally builds an entire other Spider-Man suit out of Stark tech. My biggest complaint is how much of the story relies on Peter making really dumb decisions. And Homecoming, a lot of his mistakes are forgivable because he's a year one Spider-Man and he's also 15 years old. Also, a lot of his mistakes are Tony's fault to begin with. But in this movie, it often feels like the writers lower his IQ significantly just for the plot to move forward. I like Mysterio's character and the pacing is fine enough. There's just never really any moments where I'm like, wow, this is a great Spider-Man movie. I don't hate it at all. It's just the one that I think about the least. And honestly, sometimes I think being forgettable is worse than just being bad. Now, No Way Home, this is definitely the hardest one to score because the setup and the payoff are so wildly different in quality. A lot of the major criticisms I have in this movie come from the first act. Just like in Far From Home, a lot of the plot points in this movie only happen because Peter and Doctor Strange make some wildly dumb and out of character decisions. Strange starts to cast a reality altering spell before going over any of the logistics with Peter, and then Peter doesn't even think to call MIT first. The whole thing just feels very forced. There's some other lazy writing decisions like Ned becoming a master of magic in 30 seconds just so that Tobey and Andrew can show up. Even with those criticisms though, 5 years later, I am still in disbelief that this movie even exists. It's a live action Spider-Verse crossover that was filmed during the peak of COVID. And somehow they pulled it off, all while never losing sight of the fact that this is still Tom's movie. I refuse to give into the internet's mass psychosis of
No Way Home was only ever good because of nostalgia. If you actually rewatch it, it's pretty bad.
The first 45-ish minutes are pretty messy and have some lazy writing, but the payoff at the end 100% redeems it. People have forgiven far worse writing war crimes than other Spider-Man movies. TASM 2. Spider-Man 3. But suddenly, No Way Home is unacceptable. I don't buy it. People just want to be different. But at the end of the day, I can't just ignore the incredibly messy setup because this category is specifically about writing. So now on to Peter Parker's performance / portrayal. In Homecoming, Tom Holland definitely gives me my favorite portrayal of a high school Peter Parker. I actually believe that he is the age that he's supposed to be. And a lot of people will criticize how reckless Peter is in this movie, but also that's kind of the point. He's a 15-year-old kid. This is a literal child who got superhuman powers 6 months ago and then got recruited by the Avengers. Of course, his ego is going to be inflated a little bit. A lot of his mistakes are actually Tony Stark's fault. Peter had the bad guys cornered on the ferry before the FBI showed up, which Tony tipped off, by the way. Also, if Tony didn't pack his suit with a parachute that Peter didn't even know about, he wouldn't have drowned towards the beginning of the movie, and Iron Man wouldn't have had to come and save him. And that's why the I'm nothing without this suit scene works so well. Peter proves Tony and himself wrong by defeating the Vulture in nothing but his homemade suit. This is probably the closest that any live-action Spider-Man has come to convincing me that I'm actually watching a high school kid. And also, I just love how awkwardly funny Tom's version of Peter is. Far From Home, Tom is still a really good Peter Parker. A lot of my problems, like I said, just come down to the writing and not necessarily his performance. The biggest example is obviously Edith. Peter somehow completely trusts Beck after only 2 days of knowing him, and then hands him over the most powerful surveillance weapon on the planet just because he gave him a little pep talk. And then the scene on the bus with Brad is the worst scene in the whole movie. Peter accidentally launches a drone strike on his own classmate, and then just to distract everybody, he almost swerves the entire bus off of a cliff. And then he literally pulls a, "Hey guys, look over there," so that he can jump out of the sunroof, explode the drone, land back on the ground, and somehow none of his classmates noticed. Far From Home's Peter gets a 7. Since No Way Home has 3 different Peter Parkers, I'm going to be giving each of them a score, and then Tobey and Andrew's score is going to count towards their final overall score. This is the movie where Tom finally grows into the Peter Parker that everyone wanted him to be. I still have issues with the spell at the beginning because, again, the writers dumbed down Peter a lot. Everything with Aunt May's death and onward is some of the best acting we've gotten in a Spider-Man movie. His reaction to Aunt May dying is very heartbreaking. I remember tearing up in the theater when I first saw it. It might even be better than Gwen's death scene. And when he's beating on Goblin at the end, you genuinely believe that he wants to kill him. And I love how Tobey and Andrew never overshadow Tom. This is still entirely Tom's story. Tobey and Andrew actually help Peter become the Spider-Man he's supposed to be. So No Way Home Peter gets a 9. Now Andrew is basically perfect in this movie. I have no complaints. This movie takes everything people loved about Andrew and just puts him into a better movie. He's super funny and charismatic, and he just steals every scene he's in without completely taking over the movie. Him catching MJ is such an emotional moment. You don't even need dialogue. You just know exactly how he's feeling in that moment. His performance in this movie was so great that he somehow brainwashed thousands of people into thinking that TASM 2 was a secret masterpiece. Obviously, Andrew gets a 10. Tobey doesn't really have that much emotionally to do in this movie, but I still like the way he's written. He obviously is a lot older, but he feels a lot wiser and more at peace with himself. My favorite moment is when he stops Tom from killing Goblin, because it's a nice healing moment for him from what happened in Spider-Man 1, and it also shows Spider-Man that revenge is not the answer. I do wish his performance was a little bit better, and a lot of the shots with him were not just him staring off into the void, but I still think it's awesome that he's in this, so he gets an 8.5. Now on to villains. I think Vulture is very underrated. Michael Keaton absolutely kills it, and he's very intimidating without feeling too cartoonish. I also love how they modernized his character. Making him a scavenger is so creative. He's called the Vulture, and then his whole thing is picking through alien scraps and turning it into weapons. It's just very clever. I also think his suit is a really cool adaptation. It fits the world of the MCU very well while still being very scary. He's also just very relatable. He's not injecting himself with an evil serum or trying to conquer the world or anything. He's just a guy trying to provide for his family. Yeah, he's connected to Iron Man technically, but it doesn't really bother me that much. The twist that he's Liz's father is not just one of the best twists in any Spider-Man movie, but just in any superhero movie ever. And the entire car ride with him to Homecoming is so tense, with him slowly figuring out that Peter is Spider-Man. My one complaint is that I just wish Michael Keaton had a little bit more screen time. And also, Shocker is kind of just a throwaway villain. I wish he was more important. So villains get an 8 for Homecoming. Kind of hated on Far From Home a lot, but I think Mysterio is a really good adaptation as well. Jake Gyllenhaal is also just great in everything he's in. He has a great performance here, and the suit looks awesome. I just wish that Beck was a little bit more connected to Peter instead of just being another guy with a vendetta against Tony Stark. It was fine the first time, but doing it a second time to an even greater extreme just feels a little bit too much. But also, Mysterio is a big reason why this movie goes from kind of bad to mid. So No Way Home is kind of tricky because there's 5 different reoccurring villains that show up here, but they're definitely not all doing equal amounts of work. Goblin is carrying once again. William Dafoe is just incredible. He honestly might be better in this movie than he was in 2002. Every line he delivers is just great, obviously.
Norman's on sabbatical, honey.
The hell? Him getting punched over and over by Tom and just laughing in his face is so crazy. I also really like the updated look. I think it was a great decision to get rid of the mask and then have him have that purple hoodie over his armor. It somehow looks less goofy and is more in line with the comics, which is weird. And I think Alfred Molina is also great, but I think he's the biggest example of nostalgia bait in this movie. A lot of his dialogue is just him quoting stuff that he said verbatim from Spider-Man 2. I swear he says, "The power of the sun in the palm of my hand, like 5 different times. It was cool the first time you said it, but after you repeat it 20 times, it kind of loses some of its swag. Sometimes it feels like he's a video game NPC cycling through the same dialogue options. Fan service be damned though, it's still really awesome to see him in this movie, and I like his interaction with Peter too. Now, I definitely like Electro in this more than I do in TASM 2, but he's still kind of a weak character. They pretty much completely changed his character, but he didn't really improve too drastically. All of his lines still feel very weird and awkward, and I think it just goes to show that Jamie Foxx just is not the right casting choice for this character. Then Sandman and Electro were barely in this movie. The actors were actually never even on set. All of it is just CGI and recycled footage from the older movies and voice work, but with the incredibly limited material that they had to work with, it's honestly kind of a shock how not terrible they are. It's awesome to see all these villains together again, but Goblin is really the only exceptional one, which I think was for the best, to be honest. It seems that they have learned from the past that maybe it's not the best idea to try to cram 5 different villain arcs into one single movie. Also, all these villains have already been in their own movies, so they don't really need a story or an arc, which may seem like a convenient handicap, but still, the villains in No Way Home get a 7.5. On to supporting characters. Now, this is probably my biggest criticism with Homecoming. Almost every other character besides Peter feels very one-dimensional and underdeveloped. Aunt May is basically just there for you to look at. Not complaining, by the way. Ned is funny, but he also has no depth or emotional weight. He's just kind of the comic relief. And then Liz is just Peter's crush. But I do think their relationship works for what this movie was trying to do. It teaches the lesson that Spider-Man's first love is supposed to teach him. He realizes that it's not love, it's just a crush. And by chasing Vulture instead of the girl, he learns that sometimes Spider-Man's responsibility comes before Peter Parker's desires. MJ is one of my least favorite characters in this one. She's very Cole Sprouse from Riverdale coded. Feels very dated and cringe to me. I don't think this is the best Flash Thompson, but it is the best example of a modern bully. The only real relationship that stands out to me is Tony and Peter, specifically with their conversation after the ferry fiasco. If you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it is a really good line. Then Tony saying, if you die, that's on me. It's really hard after the events of Infinity War and Endgame. Most of the characters in this movie are pretty one-dimensional, but I also think it fits pretty well with the lower stakes high school coming of age comedy vibe that this one was going for. I just wish they started to naturally mature Tom's movies with Far From Home instead of it abruptly happening with Aunt May's death. Far From Home gets a chance to develop these characters, and it just doesn't. Aunt May finding out that Peter is Spider-Man at the end of Homecoming should have been a big deal, but instead they just don't even touch on it. She's just immediately cool with it. Ned is basically just the Patrick Star of these movies again, but him and Betty are kind of funny. All it took was one plane ride and Betty is head over heels for this man. The CEO meme has never been a joke. It is definitely canon. Flash is kind of the same in this movie. He is more of like a cringy influencer in this one with all the live streaming stuff, which is kind of eye-rolling at times. And then Nick Fury is just not Nick Fury, I guess, but I just choose to ignore the whole scroll plot. I think that's so dumb. Everyone still feels pretty Disney Channel and they don't really mature at all, so they get a 4. No Way Home definitely has the strongest supporting cast in the trilogy. Aunt May is finally given something meaningful to do. She's the moral compass of the movie, and she gives Tom his version of with great power comes great responsibility. MJ is definitely a lot better in this one. I definitely buy their relationship way more. And then Ned is still Ned. He does have a few funny moments though. It's kind of annoying how he just casually masters magic in like 30 seconds, and it took Doctor Strange like years of being a monk in the mountains to do that. Speaking of, Doctor Strange is definitely my biggest complaint. He gets mad at Peter for not checking with MIT first, but like, bro, you're a grown-ass man. Maybe you should have asked him about that before performing the reality-altering spell that brainwashed millions of people. He's just as much to blame for the whole situation, to be honest, and he just shifts all the responsibility onto the shoulders of a 17-year-old kid. And then obviously, Tobey and Andrew are amazing supporting characters for this movie. It's so cool to see Tom interact with them like they're all brothers. And they could have so easily just been nostalgia bait that completely took over this movie, but they don't. Supporting characters in No Way Home get an 8. Now on to the filmmaking categories, so visual cinematography, action, swinging, and score and soundtrack. Now all of these movies exist inside the MCU, so they're all pretty gray looking and not the best visually. But in Homecoming specifically, there's some great moments, like when he's lifting the rubble. It gives me chills every time. That's one of my favorite Spider-Man moments ever. The action is kind of weak. There's not not that many memorable fight scenes. They leaned a little bit too hard into trying to show everything that the Stark suit could do instead of just letting Spider-Man be Spider-Man. And there's also basically no iconic swinging scenes in this movie either. Like Giacchino's Spider-Man theme and all of these movies, but in Homecoming, there's a lot of really good needle drops. Blitzkrieg Bop is basically a Spider-Man song to me now. Anytime I hear the Ramones, I instantly think of Homecoming. It just perfectly captures the youthful high school coming of age vibe. Homecoming's visuals get a 3, the action gets a 5, and the score gets an 8. Far From Home's visuals make a slight improvement due to Mysterio. The illusion scenes are definitely the best part of the movie, but there's only a couple of those scenes. The rest still looks like a standard MCU film, and the action has very similar problems. Again, the illusion stuff is great, but outside of that, there's not a lot of memorable stuff. Also, a lot of the climax in the final battle is just Peter fighting a bunch of drones. At least we get a final swinging scene in this one. I do like that. And then the score and soundtrack is pretty much the same. I still like it. Far From Home visuals get a 4.5, action gets a 4, and the score and soundtrack get a 7.5. These are probably the hardest categories to score for No Way Home because the highs are really high, but the lows get pretty rough. And a lot of that just comes down to this being filmed during COVID. It's still got that MCU washed out gray look, but it's also filled with way more really weak CGI and just a ton of really obvious green screens. Like Sandman and Lizard are both fully CGI, and they somehow look worse than they did a decade ago. Also, Tobey and Andrew's suit looks strangely off a lot of the time. Sometimes they genuinely look and move like a video game character. Like when Andrew jumps through the portal or the way that he lands after saving MJ, it all just looks really weird and unnatural, but the action does make up for a lot of it. Seeing all 3 Spider-Men fight together and work as a team is so awesome. It's something that I never thought I'd ever get to see. Tom's fist fights with the Green Goblin, again, are some of the best parts in the whole movie. They're just so brutal. Really feel every punch, just like in the Raimi movies. And for the score and soundtrack, I still really like Tom's theme. I just wish they incorporated Tobey and Andrew's theme a little bit more, maybe. No Way Home visuals get a 2, action gets an 8, score gets a 7.5. Now on to quips and humor. If we're counting Civil War Spider-Man, that's some of the best Spider-Man quippage we've ever gotten. But if we're just judging Homecoming, there are some quips. There's just not a ton of them. You've got the whole Avengers bank robbery scene, some stuff on the ferry, and then also the final battle on the Avengers jet. Everyone loves to praise Andrew as the quippy Spider-Man, but Tom is honestly just as naturally funny. Also, he's not cracking jokes while dozens of people are dying off screen. Other than the quips though, I think the overall movie is very funny. Ned carries a lot of the humor. I think the sacrifice he made in the computer lab is hilarious. On my last rewatch though, I will say the comedy wasn't hitting as hard for me as it did in the past. I think it's just because I've seen this a bunch though. But overall, quips and humor for Homecoming gets a 7.5. Now, Far From Home, I actually remembered this being decently funny and having a lot of quips, but on my last rewatch, I realized it's kind of not. A big reason Spider-Man doesn't actually quip in this is because a lot of his fights are just with drones. Most of the humor just comes from everything else. Ned and Betty, they're pretty funny. The teachers have some good moments. It's not as funny as Homecoming, but it's still pretty decent. Far From Home, quips and humor gets a 5.5. In No Way Home, there's not a lot of Spider-Man quips towards his villains. A lot of the comedy just comes from the 3 Peters hanging out together, which I think is great. Andrew calling Tobey a cool youth pastor, or Ned saying that Tobey is just some guy, and Andrew saying I love you guys. Pretty much every scene with all 3 Spider-Men is awesome. I will say a lot of the humor is nostalgia driven. A lot of the times the punchline is just, hey, remember that thing from your movie? But honestly, I don't really care. It works for me in my little lizard brain. So quips and humor for No Way Home get a 7.5. Now on to suit design. Now, I think the Stark suit in Homecoming gets a little bit too much hate. It definitely falls victim to the MCU's obsession with adding random unnecessary lines and tech detailing. But I do like some things like the exposed Webb cartridges. It feels very practical without compromising the design of the suit. And it's also a nice nod to the comics where he had his utility belt. And he also has the spider logo, which is from the comics. My biggest complaint isn't even really the design of the suit, it's just the CGI. Most of the time, he looks like he belongs in a PS4 game, not a movie. The suit is just so vacuum sealed and there's no texture, it just doesn't look real. My favorite suit in this movie is definitely the homemade suit. It's 100% the best homemade Spider-Man suit we've ever gotten. And I love how he finishes off the movie and defeats Vulture wearing it. It's such a nice ending to his arc. The suit design in Homecoming gets a 7.5. Far From Home kind of pisses me off with the suit design. He wears the Homecoming suit suit very briefly, but then he changes into the Night Monkey suit, which I kind of just straight up despise. I like the joke itself, I guess. It's kind of funny, but just like almost every other Tom Holland suit, its entire existence is solely just so they can sell another toy. The whole concept of it is really stupid. Nick Fury doesn't want Peter's classmates to realize that Spider-Man is in Europe with him, so he makes Peter a stealth suit, but then puts two massive white Spider-Man lenses on the mask. And then he wears the Iron Spider suit a little bit in this one, and it somehow looks even worse than it did in Infinity War. Not only is the suit just very dull in MCU, but it also just looks so much worse compared to what it looks like in the comics. My favorite suit is definitely the black and red one that he builds at the end. It looks a little bit better than the Homecoming suit to me, and it's also a nice little nod to Amazing Fantasy 15, where Spider-Man's suit was originally supposed to be black and red. I think the No Way Home suits might actually be worse. He starts off with the Far From Home suit, which I already talked about. I like that one. But then he gets into the Iron Spider suit again for some reason. And then the nanotech of the suit attaching and pairing to Doc Ock's arms doesn't really make sense. And then Doc Ock gives him back the nanotech, and it creates a new logo over top of his Far From Home suit, which I guess counts as another suit. Yeah, it's just another excuse to sell another action figure, but it also just doesn't look good. And then there's the black and gold Inside Out suit. He gets green goo on his suit, so then he has to turn it inside out. None of these suits really justify their existence, but the ending suit that he makes himself, that is definitely not only the best suit in this movie, but just the best Tom Holland suit. But we only really see it for like 30 seconds, so No Way Home suit design gets a 6. Now on to rewatchability, or how well these movies have aged. I think Homecoming has honestly aged really well. A lot of people hated on it initially because it was so different from the last two, but again, I like how it carved out its own identity. It didn't just try to reheat Sam Raimi's nachos for a second time. I already talked about how I like the youthful feel and the lower stakes, more grounded story, but I also think those things have aged incredibly well now because we've gotten stories like No Way Home and Brand New Day that are a lot more mature interpretations of the character. So getting to see his entire arc and literally growing up with Peter Parker in real time is just so awesome, and it's something we didn't get to do with the first two iterations. I always love rewatching Homecoming. It gets an 8.5. Far From Home is definitely my least favorite Spider-Man movie to rewatch. Like I said, it is just very forgettable. It feels the most connected to the MCU. A lot of it is built up around following up Avengers Endgame, and everyone's still talking about Iron Man. It just feels very tied to a specific moment in time. The only actually important thing that this movie gives you in terms of Spider-Man is Peter's identity reveal and the setup for No Way Home. I still enjoy revisiting this movie. It's not terrible, but in the grand scheme of Spider-Man movies, it's pretty mid. Far From Home gets a 5. No Way Home seems to be the target Spider-Man movie for people saying it's only good because of nostalgia and it's a terrible rewatch. Obviously, when it came out, I was super caught up in the hype, just like everyone else. I was honestly worried for a long time that after the nostalgia wore off, that I wouldn't like it as much. But despite what all the pessimists have to say online, that is just not the case. I actually appreciate this movie for a lot of reasons other than Tobey and Andrew now. Yeah, it's not as shocking now when I see Tobey and Andrew because I know they're showing up, but it makes me pay attention to Tom's story a lot more. It definitely has its plot holes and weak writing and a lot of bad CGI and visuals, but the emotional core of it is still very much intact, and it's just so fun to watch all three Spider-Men interact together. So No Way Home gets a 9. Now on to the Peter suffering meter. In Homecoming, I think Tom gets it pretty easy here, and that's a big criticism for a lot of people, but I think it works for what it's trying to be. A lot of Peter's consequences in this movie are like, oh no, I can't go to Homecoming, which is still sad, but compared to other movies, Peter doesn't really suffer, so Homecoming gets a 2. Far From Home is kind of the same thing, honestly. He doesn't really go through that much. He does get hit by a bullet train though, and he still kicks Vulture's ass. But compared to what comes next, this is basically just the tutorial, so Far From Home gets a 4. No Way Home is probably peak Peter Parker suffering.
His identity is revealed for the first half of the movie, and all of New York hates him. Not only does he get rejected into his dream school, but also do both of his best friends, and it's entirely his fault. And then Aunt May dies in his arms, and that's also his fault. And then the ending, he has to make the ultimate sacrifice of having everyone forget who he is.
He's completely alone in his tiny little apartment, broke and depressed, just like Spider-Man should be. So No Way Home gets a 10. Now on to comic accuracy. I actually think Homecoming is one of the most misunderstood Spider-Man movies when it comes to this topic. A lot of people are too quick to judge Tom Holland's Spider-Man because it's not identical to Sam Raimi, but that doesn't mean that it's not comic accurate. When I first read through Stan Lee's original run, Tom's Peter reminds me way more of those early issues than Tobey and Andrew do. The comics actually let Peter spend some time in high school and just being a naive kid that makes mistakes. Despite being being incredibly smart, and that's basically what this whole movie is. If they decided to skip his awkward high school phase, I don't think his more mature stories would be hitting as hard today. And a lot of people might say that Peter looking up to Tony is not comic accurate, but he looked up to a lot of heroes in the comics. In the early comics, instead of Iron Man, it was Human Torch. Peter looked up to him and wanted to be him, but over time he realized that he needed to become his own hero. And that's basically the exact same arc they give him in this movie with Tony, but people just don't really seem to realize that, I guess. And then, of course, the rubble lifting sequence is one of the most iconic moments in the comics, and I'm so glad they adapted it into a movie because it's one of the best scenes in any Spider-Man movie ever. Homecoming gets an 8. From Far From Home, like I said, I really like how they adapted Mysterio. He's basically just Syndrome from Incredibles. He's like pretending to be a superhero, and then he ends up turning on Spider-Man. Also, I think changing his backstory from being a special effects stuntman in Hollywood was a good decision, and it fits better for the MCU. And this pretty much goes for all the movies, but the supporting cast is pretty different. MJ is Michelle Jones, and then Ned is basically just Genki from Miles Morales' comics. Far From Home gets a 5, I guess. No Way Home obviously takes the same creative liberties as the other two, but there's also a lot of stuff that's pretty similar to the comics. There's a lot of stories where Peter's identity becomes public and he has to deal with that. There's also stories where Peter has to alter people's memories in order to keep them safe. And then obviously we finally get his version of with great power comes great responsibility. It's not a direct adaptation of any single story. It kind of just mixes a bunch of ideas together. But the ending is where this movie finally feels like classic Spider-Man. No Way Home gets a 7.5.
Finally, what you've all been waiting for.
Spider-Man Brand New Day. Before I get into this one, I've only seen it 2 times so far, and it's only been out for about a week and a half. I have had some time to sit with this, but my opinions are definitely going to change a little bit over time. This is just where I'm at right now at the current moment. Heads up, I'm not really going to bother trying to bob and weave my way around spoiling the movie, because if you haven't seen it at this point, it's kind of on you. So most of the big spoilers are going to come during the villains category, and if you haven't seen this movie yet for some reason and you don't want to get it spoiled, just skip to the end when I rank all these movies and give each Spider-Man their score. I'm going to do that after reviewing this movie. Starting with the writing. A lot of people have been comparing it to Spider-Man 2, and I think that's for a good reason, because this movie is just the inverse of that movie. Spider-Man 2 was Spider-Man no more, and Brand New Day is Peter Parker no more. And in Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker is starting to lose his powers, and in this movie, Peter is gaining new powers and becoming more and more like a spider, because he's spent so much time behind the mask that he's starting to lose the person underneath it. He's been completely alone for the past 4 years, just pouring his entire existence into Spider-Man, and he's convinced himself that he can do it all alone and that he doesn't need anybody. I just love how hard they commit to that theme of loneliness and isolation, because you can have all these really incredible action scenes and cool shots of him swinging, but none of that matters if there's no emotional weight behind the story. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And that idea of self-isolation is something that I think a lot of people can relate to. We've all had those periods of time where we pour ourselves into our work, our responsibilities, our passions, our problems, whatever our version of the mask is, and we push the people in our lives that care about us away. I just love how mature and emotional this movie is, especially compared to his other trilogy. Like, I've always loved the Home trilogy. I always loved that it took a different approach, but I think there was always a very limited shelf life for that coming-of-age style of Spider-Man movie. His first 3 movies were essentially his 3-act origin story, and you can argue all day about whether that was an intentional choice from the beginning or not, but it really doesn't matter because it all worked out at the end of the day. Brand New Day. Because now, looking back, we get this incredible contrast between the first movie where he was literally a 15-year-old baby, and now a decade later where he's a depressed, broke 23-year-old. Marvel actually allowed us to grow up in real time with Peter. This is a spoiler for the ending of this movie, but I really like how they took one of the worst scenes in Homecoming and redeemed it. The scene before the credits roll where Aunt May finds out that Peter is Spider-Man never really had any consequences or emotional weight. They kind of just played it off as a joke. But in Brand New Day, that exact moment becomes one of the most important moments in Peter's character development. We finally get to hear that conversation that they had and May's whole message about how Peter's life's going to change a lot and that the world is not going to treat him fairly, but the ones that love him are going to continue to love him, not because he's super powerful and awesome, but because he's Peter. I just love that message, and I love how it's the thing that finally breaks through to the villain. Overall though, I really just like the pacing and structure of it. There's a lot of stuff going on, but it doesn't feel like it's desperately trying to set up 5 different MCU sequels or anything. Everything is still pretty contained. Yeah, they're introducing a lot of stuff that's going to be very important in the future for all the X-Men and mutant stuff, but all of it is still important within the context and confines of this specific story, so it doesn't take away from it. I think the one major thing holding back the writing for me is Sadie Sink's character, which I'm gonna touch on later, but everything else is great. This movie has a lot to chew on. It's the most mature and emotional Tom Holland story we've got. Writing gets a 9 out of 10. For Peter Parker's performance/portrayal, I think this is the best overall performance we've gotten out of Tom Holland. I don't necessarily think it contains Tom Holland's greatest moment. I would probably give that to the stuff in No Way Home after Aunt May died. That's a more impressive, isolated performance. But in Brand New Day, this is the best Peter Parker that we've gotten consistently from beginning to end.
He's more mature and emotionally complicated. He's depressed and lonely and broke and awkward.
He's Peter Parker. I love it. And again, I love that we have the home trilogy so that we can have this contrast, because he used to be so excited and carefree and obsessed with being a superhero. But Brand New Day's Peter has been through some shit. This is probably the most relatable Spider-Man has ever felt. There were countless amount of moments in this movie where I was internally going, that is literally me. The scene with him building Legos with Ned and MJ, Peter telling MJ that this is the most fun he's had in years. It's very sad, but it's also just very sweet in a way, and unfortunately, very relatable. This movie just hit really close to home for me, and not really because I relate to Peter Parker's circumstances necessarily, but more so just his mindset. I know exactly what it's like to convince yourself that self-isolation is better than being vulnerable and letting people in. And I think Tom just does an incredible job at communicating that message. Also, this dude has some sauce now. The New York accent.
You trying to take my job, Spider-Man? Hey, you guys are the professionals. I'm just a volunteer.
This is the most friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has ever felt. He's out in New York stopping crimes, talking to cops, helping out random kids, and just being a part of the community. He's not waiting on Avengers HQ to tell him what to do. He's just being Spider-Man. Tom just has a great performance from beginning to end. So Brand New Day's Peter Parker gets a 10. Now it's time for villains. Spoiler warning. Sadie Sink plays Jean Grey in this movie and is the primary antagonist for most of it. This is where I'm the most conflicted with this movie. I'll just get into the positives first, because there are some incredible villain moments. The rooftop scene with MJ is insane. That whole fake out is one of the biggest jaw drop moments in any Spider-Man movie. It's up there with Vulture being revealed as Liz's dad in Homecoming. And the movie just does a really good job at making Jean genuinely terrifying. And even though that makes for some really cool scenes, it's also where some of my biggest problems with this movie stem from. She possesses countless people and unconsensually makes them do things. For example, just to aura farm in front of Peter, she walks an elderly man into oncoming traffic and he gets hit by a van. I'm not really sure what this random citizen has to do with her trying to find her sister, but I don't really think that was necessary. And then she weaponizes and hijacks not only Scorpion, but also the Hulk, putting a countless amount of people in danger. And they don't specifically show a lot of people dying from this stuff, but it's kind of hard to believe that nobody died during all of this chaos. And then probably the worst of all, she gets inside of MJ's head and forces her to kiss Peter before throwing her off of a roof. And just the things that she makes MJ say to Peter, like, yeah, there's really nothing up here about you. And when she's hugging him and she's like, yeah, Peter, hold her.
Feel her.
That's just straight up evil. Also, keep in mind, all those things that I just mentioned happened before she even knew that her sister was dead. At that point, she was still trying to find her. And then once she finally uncovers that truth, she threatens to kill not only Mr. Milkshake, but also all of the thousands of people that she has trapped in her telepath bubble. The movie spends a large portion of its runtime establishing Jean as the most terrifying and evil villain that Peter has ever had to face. So her redemption at the end just feels kind of cheap and it doesn't land fully for me. Peter even tells Jean on the rooftop when she's about to throw MJ off a roof, if you loved anybody as much as I loved her, you would know what you're doing right now is unforgivable. So I just feel really conflicted because I understand what the movie is trying to do. It's trying to get you to understand Jean so that you can sympathize with her. She's completely alone. Her mom abandoned her and her sister, and then her sister got kidnapped, and she's lashing out at the entire world because of it. And I think Peter is a nice parallel to her because who else can relate more to her than him? But I don't know. I'm still unsure how to feel because a lot of this depends on what Marvel decides to do with her character in the future. Because if they just brush everything that she did in this movie aside and just go, oh, you guys, she was just sad because her sister died. Give her a break. That would not work for me, I'm sorry. Her backstory explains why she's angry, but it does not excuse all the evil stuff she does in this movie. And I can already see some of the comments. I know a lot of people have been comparing her to people like Scarlet Witch and Loki, since those are both characters who went from evil villain to being redeemed. But I don't think either of those are particularly fair comparisons. First of all, Loki is supposed to be a villain. That's his character. And the version of him that got redeemed in the show is a variant alternate universe version of him. And as for Wanda, her story is definitely way more complicated and tragic than Jean's is. Also, neither Loki or Wanda were central antagonists within a solo Spider-Man movie. It's just not the same thing at all. Jean Grey is being introduced as one of the faces of the future X-Men, and she partakes in some absolutely horrific shit. I think Damage Control being the actual twist villain is not only pretty predictable, but also just very underwhelming. Mr. Milkshake is a really good actor, and they barely give him anything to do in this movie. I would have loved to see him as a traditional villain. Instead, he's just kind of a guy in a black suit. And because Jean is so cartoonishly evil in the first act of the movie, it actually makes Damage Control's actions seem reasonable. And then from Punisher's perspective, if this girl has the ability to control a massive amount of people and is actively threatening to kill all of them, yeah, I totally understand why he would shoot her. I also just wish we had gotten more of Spider-Man's rogues gallery. I understand not wanting to repeat any of the villains that they did in live action, and I appreciate that this movie is trying something new. But when you're watching a Spider-Man movie and the main villain isn't a classic Spider-Man villain, it's always going to be a little bit disappointing. I like that we get Tombstone and Boomerang and people like that very briefly, and I'm really hoping they do more with them in the future, but Scorpion was severely underused, way more than I expected. He's basically just a pawn in Jean's chess game. The villains for Brand New Day get an 8.5. Onto supporting characters, I was a little iffy about them coming back in this movie, but I think Ned and MJ are fantastic. They're utilized better here than they have been in the entire trilogy. Kind of the same thing as Jean though. A lot of my opinions depend on what they decide to do in the future with them, because the ending with Ned and MJ, spoiler alert, was a little bit ambiguous with not knowing if they remember Peter or not. So if they decide to just completely undo the spell from No Way Home, that'll feel kind of cheap and really dampen the impact of the ending of that movie. I was worried that Punisher being in a Spider-Man movie was going to turn this into a goofy MCU crossover where Frank was just making edgy jokes and shooting people the whole time, and then Spider-Man would look into the camera and go, "Welp, that just happened." But unfortunately, John Bernthal is incredible. His chemistry and dynamic with Tom Holland is so good, and it makes for some of the best scenes and funniest moments in this movie. But it's not just played for gags. Punisher actually has a purpose to the plot, and his relationship to Peter actually holds some emotional weight. There's one conversation where Peter tells Frank that he's just like him because he keeps to himself all the time, and Frank tells Peter, he's like, "You think this lifestyle is a choice? No, kid, this is a sentence. You think if I knew for 1 second that my family was alive, I would be hiding behind a mask?" I just love that whole conversation. It really resonated with me, and I love how it's kind of a wake-up call for Peter. I just wish that the conversation went on for a little bit longer and they had a little bit more back and forth. I also really do like Bruce Banner and his purpose within the plot and his connection to Peter. And spoiler alert, Yelena is very funny. I'm always happy to see Florence Pugh in a movie. I think Jean DeWolf is a really nice addition too. I love how she kind of has a motherly relationship with Peter, and she's kind of the only person that he talks to. She also contributes a lot to this being the most Batman feeling Spider-Man movie. Peter is working with a detective and constantly hiding behind a mask. She's basically his version of Jim Gordon. Supporting characters in Brand New Day get a 9.5. Now on to the 3 filmmaking categories, so visuals, action, and the score and soundtrack. This is definitely the strongest aspect of this movie. First off, it's just gorgeous. The colors, the lighting, the way they shoot New York City, and I love how much of it is grounded in practical effects in conjunction with CGI, which is how I think Marvel should always do it. And the action is just insane. The swinging is the most TASM 2 swinging that we've gotten since TASM 2. A lot of the shots here feel like they could be ripped straight out of that movie, and honestly, a lot of them are better. It's hard to talk about all of this without sounding like a 4-year-old, but it just looks so cool. The way Peter moves and uses his webs and his spider sense, the way the camera moves around him during fights. The Hulk fight is crazy. The hand fight is crazy. I think those are 2 sequences that people are going to be talking about for a long time. When I say I want a comic book movie to feel and look like a comic book, this is what I'm talking about. I'd say my only actual criticism is some of the swinging can feel kind of weightless at times. I think that's just due to the practical cable work they were doing. And then unfortunately, a lot of the best moments from the fight were shown in the trailers, which kind of sucks because I would have loved to experience a lot of these moments blind. But that's more of a marketing problem, not really a problem with the movie itself. And then the score and soundtrack is probably my favorite in all of Tom Holland's movies. I really like how they strip back Tom's theme and make it feel more lonely and spaced out to match how Peter is feeling emotionally. And I really like all the needle drops. I've been listening to the soundtrack a lot since it came out, and I just know in 5 years when I'm listening to these songs again, I'm gonna be yearning for the summer of 26. Brand New Day's visuals get a 10, the action also gets a 10, and then the score and soundtrack get an 8.5. Now on to quips and humor. There isn't a ton of Spider-Man quippage in this, but the ones that we do get are fantastic. Let's End This on a High Note is probably my favorite.
Let's end this on a high note, huh?
And then obviously the scene where he's stretching from the trailers. But most of the funniest moments come from Spider-Man and Punisher's dynamic. What I appreciate most about this movie's humor is that it actually lets emotional moments breathe and serious moments be serious. One of my biggest problems with a lot of MCU movies is how often they will build up an emotional moment just to immediately undercut it with a really dumb joke. But Brand New Day is much better about that. There's still plenty of jokes and funny moments, but every serious, emotionally charged moment is not immediately cut off with so that was awkward. Quips and humor get an 8.5. Onto suit design. This is the best Spider-Man suit that we have ever gotten in live action. The only one that really rivals it for me is The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but I think this one is better. The colors, the fabric, the fact that you can actually see Tom's eyes through the lenses. It's very subtle, but it just makes his Spider-Man so much more expressive on top of the lenses that move. You can also see his jaw move a little bit when he talks, and you see a little outline of his ears on the side. The way that the fabric folds and bends and creases and catches the light feels like a physical object that actually exists. And it also just looks ripped straight out of a comic book. There's no notes or critiques that I have. 10 out of 10. Now on to rewatchability, or I guess more so just how well I think this movie is gonna age in the future. Like I said, I've only seen it twice. It's been out for a week and a half. So obviously there's a horse shit load of recency bias that's going into this, but I got done watching it for a second time and I immediately wanted to watch it again. A lot of this movie's rewatchability hinges on what they're gonna do with the X-Men, the Avengers, Spider-Man 5, all that stuff. If they fumble Jean's story and just let her get off scot-free, I'm definitely gonna look back at this movie differently. But at the same time, I also don't think there's too much they can do to ruin my opinion on this movie, knock on wood, because it's surprisingly self-contained. You can pretty easily just watch this as a standalone Spider-Man story and ignore all the larger MCU implications. So I don't think this score is going to change that drastically. If anything, I could see it going up. But right now, I'm gonna give Brand New Day a 9 for rewatchability. Time for the 2 bonus categories. Comic accuracy. I know Jean DeWolf is a very important character in the comics, and her death famously leads up to the creation of Venom's character. So I'm definitely excited to see what they do with that. And I know there are some storylines where Peter has to deal with people forgetting him and their memories being erased. And there's obviously a ton of iconography and mythology pulled from the comics throughout this movie. But I don't really know anything about Spider-Man's history with Jean Grey to sit here and give some super informed analysis. So I guess I'll just give this a 7. Now for the Peter Parker suffering meter, I mean, come on. This is the most depressed and lonely Peter has ever been. He's broke, the love of his life doesn't remember him in the slightest. And then another spoiler alert, I guess, he literally gets shot in the chest and is on death's door until Jean, saves him. But most importantly, I love how this movie uses Peter's suffering to communicate the message that we don't have to go through life alone. Kind of ironic, but a lot of Peter's suffering in this movie is self-inflicted, and it's so awesome to see him learn that and make the change. It's such a valuable lesson to put into a Spider-Man movie, especially in this day and age, with this being the loneliest generation of kids in their 20s just sitting on social media all day and self-isolating and watching other people live their lives instead of going out and living their own. It really resonated with me personally, so I just hope that this movie was as much of a wake-up call for everyone else as it was for me. And if it wasn't, go watch it again because I loved it even more the second time. Peter Parker's suffering meter for Brand New Day gets a 10. I thought it would be fun to go back and look at my original Spider-Man movie ranking before I even started this video, and then reveal the final scores for everything and re-rank the list based off those scores, and finally crown the winner for who is the best Spider-Man. I'll explain very briefly why I have each movie where it is, because I yapped a lot about all these movies. So if you just skip to this part and you want to know why I have some of these opinions, go watch the rest of the video, okay? I have Far From Home in last place just because it's the most mid and forgettable Spider-Man movie, like I said before. I actually don't think it's the objective worst Spider-Man movie. I think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is objectively worse than Far From Home. When I'm rewatching all these movies, movies, I am the least excited to watch Far From Home. I'm more excited to watch TASM 2, and that's why it's above it. And then I have Spider-Man 3 right above TASM 2. These two could really change on a dime for me, to be honest. I do think Spider-Man 3 is the objective better movie. And then I have The Amazing Spider-Man 1. This movie is kind of just like a 7 or 8 out of 10 all the way through. There's not really any extremely low points or any extremely high points, and that's why it's kind of just smack dab in the middle. And for all of you TASM 2 defenders, there are times where I'm more excited to watch TASM 2 than I am The Amazing Spider-Man 1 because the highs are just so good. So maybe one day I'll come to my senses and put this above TASM 1, but that's about as far as I would put it, to be honest. I don't see it going any further than that. The switch up ride or die people for TASM 2 are a little bit too dramatic with their takes on this movie, and I definitely don't think it's a top 3 Spider-Man movie. That's just absurd. But yeah, let's move this movie back to where it belongs. Next up, I got Spider-Man Homecoming. I already said my piece on this movie. I will defend this movie till the day I die, but I don't necessarily think it's the best Spider-Man movie. Right above Homecoming, I have No Way Home. Now, I do think it's objectively a worse movie than Homecoming, but just all the excitement and what that movie accomplished for me puts it above Homecoming. But I will acknowledge that the first half of that movie is pretty weak, and nostalgia is doing a little bit of heavy lifting. It's definitely not carrying this movie like a lot of pessimists like to say, but it is doing a little bit of work. So No Way Home and Homecoming could kind of flip-flop for me too. I just personally get way more excited to watch No Way Home. And then my top 2, the GOATs, Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2. I can already see the comments now. There's going to be tons of people that didn't even watch the whole video and just skipped to this part and are just going to say that I'm saying this because of nostalgia. If you didn't grow up with Tobey's movies, I can totally see you being a little bit lower on them than everyone else. But if you at least don't have Spider-Man 2 in your top 3, I think there's genuinely something wrong with you. I genuinely believe that if I had never seen a single Spider-Man movie my entire life and I just decided to watch all of these movies today, I would have these 2 movies at least in my top 4, if not the top 2. In order to hate these movies, it has to be incredibly forced, or it's rage bait, or you're just stupid. Now, you probably noticed that Brand New Day is not on this list, and that's because I've kind of been avoiding ranking it because I'm still kind of iffy on how I feel about it, specifically the stuff with the villains, but I'm just gonna have to bite the bullet for this video. Now, you can tell by the actual star ranking of all these movies where it's gonna end up. It's gonna be somewhere between TASM 1 and Spider-Man 1. Now, I think it's the objective best Tom Holland movie in terms of just a consistent movie from beginning to end, and also just in terms of writing. And I also think it's got the best action, the best visuals, the best soundtrack. I would say the only thing it's really lacking that the rest of the trilogy has is just a classic Spidey villain as the central antagonist, but I don't think that's enough to drag it down. It's definitely above Homecoming. Maybe the high points in No Way Home are better than the high points in Brand New Day, like his acting with Aunt May and all that stuff, but as of right now, I think I'm gonna put it above No Way Home. And like I said, this may be recency bias, but this is just where I have it on my ranking right now. There's been a lot of people saying that this is the best live-action Spider-Man movie since Spider-Man 2, and I can kind of see that. I don't think I'm ever gonna say this is better than Spider-Man 1 or 2. I just adore those movies, and they live inside this sacred corner of my soul. This is my official live-action Spider-Man movie ranking. Notice how I said live-action, because if I included all the animated movies in this one, they would absolutely clear. But now it's time to compare this list with the actual final scores that this movie got and re-rank everything according to my scoring system. Gosh, this is the most nerdy thing I've ever done. Anyways, in 10th place with a score of 57, this is out of 100 by the way, we have Spider-Man Far From Home. So far, we are 1 for 1. Everything is looking good, don't have to rearrange anything. In 9th place with a score of 62.5, we have Spider-Man 3. So Spider-Man 3 is gonna move down 1, but that's not a big deal for me because like I said those two were interchangeable anyway. So in 8th place with a score of 70, we have The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So this does not have to move at all. In 7th place with a score of 73, we have Spider-Man No Way Home. That's kind of crazy. That's an upset for sure. But it does make sense because like I said, the first half of this movie is pretty messy, and that was definitely reflected in my scoring, but it's kind of crazy to see it all the way down here with TASM 2. And then 4th and 5th place actually tied for the exact same score of 74. That is The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man Homecoming. Personally, I'm going to keep TASM 1 below Homecoming, but just know that these are both tied for the same exact score. And then in 3rd place with a score of 86.5, we have Spider-Man 1 from 2002. This is a very interesting top 2 because a lot of people are saying that Brand New Day is the best Spider-Man movie since Spider-Man 2. Who's going to come out on top? I already know, I'm looking at the score right now. But in 2nd place, a score of 90.5, we have Spider-Man 2. And that kind of pains me. It's going below Brand New Day. Number 1, Brand New Day got a score of 93. So it's just 2.5 points above Spider-Man 2. I do think there's a lot of recency bias going into this, but there you have it. This is my ranking of all the Spider-Man movies according to the objective scoring system that I did in this video. I don't think this list is too crazy. I do think it's a little wild having No Way Home that low. Other than that, everything else was pretty much the same. For those of you who are interested, here are the final scoreboards for each of the actors. We got Tobey's here, and we got Andrew's right here, sandwiched in between, and then we got Tom Holland's here at the bottom. And now for the finale of everything. This is kind of the entire reason why I made this video. We are going to crown who is the quote-unquote best Spider-Man. Again, I would just like to reiterate, this is all still subjective. This was all just for fun. Basically what I did was, for each category, I just averaged each actor's score. So like for writing, I just took the 3 scores that Tobey got for writing and averaged them together. So you can go through here and see how each actor stacks against each other. I even added a little color key. So all the green scores are the highest ones, the red ones are the lowest ones, and then the yellow ones are just second place. So you can see Tobey got a lot of first place. That was mainly due to the filmmaking categories, obviously, because Sam Raimi's the GOAT. But he also got first place for writing, rewatchability, and surprisingly enough, suit design. I think that's just the law of averages. Andrew got first place for Peter Parker, not very surprising there, but Tom is pretty close behind him. And then he also got first place for supporting characters and quips and humor. Not very surprising. I did expect Tom to get some higher scores here, but most of the time when he's second place, he's just barely trailing behind the other two. But it does make sense that he got the lowest scores for all of the filmmaking categories. I also took all of the final movie scores and averaged them together, and then each actor got a final score for their set of movies. So in third place, I'm very sad to say, but we have Andrew Garfield with a score of 72. And then in third place, we have Tom Holland with a score of 74.3. And in first place, we have Tobey with a score of 79.8. Now, obviously, there's going to be tons of you that disagree with these scores in this ranking of the actors. Even I disagree with this. This is not the way I would personally rank these 3. Now, you might be wondering, Isaac, how the hell can you disagree with your own ranking? You're the one that gave them the scores that they got. And that's because I think this whole debate is way more of a nuanced conversation. All the scores do a decent job at showing how each actor performs across each category, just in general. But I don't really think this whole debate should be a math equation. And I personally believe if you are a true fan of Spider-Man, the character, it should be hard for you to do a ranking of the 3 or pick a favorite. Not because they're all perfect, because they all have their own set of weaknesses, but they also all bring something unique and of value to the character. And I love how we've gotten 3 different distinct versions that have spanned across decades, because it's almost like each new generation gets their own Spider-Man. There's a reason why people get so attached to a specific version of the character. People's favorite Spider-Man tells more about them than I think they realize. I think it's a little bit more complicated than just who you grew up with. I think it's more so just who you relate to the most. And I think they're all very relatable, just in different ways. So let's make the argument for why Tobey Maguire would be considered the best. I think he is a great Peter Parker. I don't think he's the strongest actor out of the 3. I think where Tobey's version of the character really shines is just the movies themselves, because Sam Raimi made some pretty damn incredible superhero movies, especially for the time that they were made. It's not just because of nostalgia. Spider-Man 1 and 2 are classics for a reason. They're basically the poster child for what a superhero blockbuster movie should look like. When people say Tobey Maguire is the GOAT, I think they're usually talking about the package around him.
The action and the complicated emotional theme and the villain and the score and the cinematography.
Just all the Raimi-isms. So when a lot of people say Tobey is the GOAT, I think what they really mean without even really realizing it is Sam Raimi is the GOAT. Tobey is good in them. He's obviously the face of those movies. He's Spider-Man. But if you just isolate Tobey's portrayal and presence on screen and compare it to Andrew and Tom, I don't really think he comes out on top. I totally understand if you say Tobey is the best if you are specifically talking about who has the best movies. He has a pretty big advantage. He has Spider-Man 1 and 2 on his resume. It's kind of a cheat code. This is why this debate is so complicated, because making the argument for why Andrew is the best is basically just the complete opposite. Andrew himself is phenomenal. He's arguably the best actor out of the 3. The problem is he wasn't given that many chances, and the chances that he did get, it really wasn't the best material to work with. So if we're just talking about movies, I don't really think you can make an argument for Andrew. I really do wish Andrew got dealt a better hand and he got more chances to put on the mask. I would love to live inside a world where The Amazing Spider-Man 3 exists, and I really hope that one day Sony can lock in and make that happen. But just given the circumstances, I think that Andrew is at the bottom when it comes to movies. And when arguing for why Tom Holland is the best, the conversation is a little bit different because he's a part of a completely different universe. Him existing inside the MCU just inevitably comes with a lot of changes, like the Iron Boy Jr. stuff and just the inclusion of other MCU characters. The fact that Far From Home feels more like a Disney Channel road trip movie than a Spider-Man movie. So I understand the people that dislike those changes. Common take that I've heard a lot of people say is is Tobey is the best Peter, Andrew is the best Spider-Man, and then Tom is the best at both. And I feel like that's a pretty damn good way to describe it. That's the easiest, most non-controversial way to cap off this debate. But with the release of Brand New Day, I do think that Tom is starting to gain some speed, and he's getting within striking distance of Tobey in terms of who has the best movie. Going back to the debate of who has the best isolated performance or portrayal and disregarding like the quality of their movies, I'm sad to say this because I love the guy, but Tobey is pretty obviously at the bottom. And then for me personally, it's kind of a toss-up between Tom and Andrew. But if we're just going based off pure consistency, I think Andrew wins this. Every performance that he's gotten, he has absolutely killed it despite everything else surrounding him. Tobey is the best Spider-Man in terms of movies, and then Andrew is the best Spider-Man in terms of just an isolated performance. But in terms of who my personal favorite is, I think I would have to give that to Tom. It's always been really hard for me to answer who my personal favorite Spider-Man is, but I think Brand New Day kind of solidified it in my brain for me because it made me realize how cool it is that I've literally gotten to grow up with Tom Holland in real time. When Captain America Civil War came out, I was 14 years old. I was basically the exact same age that Peter Parker was.
And then Homecoming came out, which I've loved from day one. And then Far From Home came out, which was a little bit of a step down. And then No Way Home came out in 2021, and not only was it just straight peak and one of the best theater experiences of my whole life, but also I was still the same age as Peter. He was graduating high school in that movie, and I had just graduated that spring. And then fast forward to now, Brand New Day comes out, and I'm still the exact same age as Peter.
Obviously, Tom Holland himself is like 30, but it's just so cool how this fictional character has literally grown up alongside me. It's literally the same phenomenon of why millennials love Harry Potter and Taylor Swift so much. Ironically, I feel more nostalgic towards Tom's Spider-Man than I do towards Tobey or Andrew. Tom is the one I've actually spent time growing up with. And because of all that, I think I can officially make the announcement that Tom Holland is my personal favorite Spider-Man. Ultimately though, I think the best part about this debate is that there isn't a clear winner. I respect all three opinions. I think you can make an argument for any of them being the best. I don't think there is one definitive Spider-Man, and I think that's very poetic. Like literally anybody can wear the mask. Someday, someone else is gonna put on the suit. We're gonna get a live action Miles Morales eventually. And after that, there's probably gonna be another Peter Parker, and some 5-year-old kid is probably gonna go to the theater with his dad to see those movies and decide, that's my Spider-Man. And then when he becomes a teenager, he'll probably be saying that Tom Holland fans are blinded by nostalgia. I've been yapping for a little bit too long. The point is, maybe there really isn't a definitive best Spider-Man. Maybe it's just whichever Spider-Man happened to be there when you needed him the most. I just came up with that outro off the dome. That was kind of poetic, I'm not gonna lie. That was an absolute bar to end off the video, if I do say so myself.